Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 1, the Hebrew Alphabet. In this lecture, we will cover the 23 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. We will also cover the 5 consonants that have final forms. We will identify the 6 Begad Kafad consonants, the 4.5 guttural consonants, and then we will discuss traditional versus modern pronunciation. The first thing to do is to take a look at the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet consists of 23 consonants written from right to left, and they appear on your screen in red. Before we read through this alphabet together, let me say 3 things about this alphabet that may be of interest to you. 1, scholars are now suggesting that this may be the oldest alphabet in the history of the world, a gigantic advance in technology. Secondly, it is the oldest alphabet that is still in use today. And third, it is the alphabet that contains the language of the entire Hebrew Bible, and that Hebrew Bible constitutes over 75% of the Christian Bible. So if you want to study the Bible in the original language, you're going to want to love and learn the Hebrew alphabet. Let's say these letters together, working from right to left. There's no need to memorize anything at this point. Just follow along and repeat after me as we work through the 23 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Waw, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tau. These are the 23 letters or consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. There are no vowels in this alphabet. We'll learn the vowel symbols in Chapter 2. Let's take a look at a chart that contains important information about the Hebrew alphabet. In the chart on your screen, you're going to see the Hebrew letter, the name of that letter spelled in English, and the basic pronunciation value. What's important to understand is that the name of the letter will help you with the pronunciation. So keep that in mind as we're working through these names. Let's begin with Aleph. It's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it is silent in its pronunciation. Next is Beit, and it sounds like the B as in boy. Gimel sounds like the G in God. Dalet sounds like the D in day. Hey sounds like the H in hay. Waw sounds like the W in way. Zayin sounds like the Z in the proper noun Zion. Chet sounds like the CH in the German word Bach, pronounced back in the throat with the guttural sound. Tet is one of the T sounds in Hebrew, and it sounds like the T in toy. Yod sounds like the Y in yes. Kaf is pronounced like the K in king, and Lamed is pronounced like the L in lion. You'll notice with most of these forms, the letter that begins the spelling of the name in English is the sound of that letter. Let's continue to see how that works. In the right-hand column, Mem sounds like the M in mother. Nun sounds like the N in now. Samik is one of the S sounds in Hebrew, and it sounds like the S in sin. Ayin, like Aleph, is silent, and so we'll pronounce that with the vowel that appears with it, but we won't learn the vowels until Chapter 2. Pei sounds like the P in pastor. Tzadeh sounds like the TS in boots. Kof sounds like the K in king. The Kof and the Kaf sound alike. Resh sounds like the R in run. Sin is another of the S sounds in Hebrew, and it sounds like the S in sin, just like Samik. Shin is another S sound. It looks exactly like the sin above, but it has a dot to the right to distinguish the sin from the shin. The shin with the dot on the right sounds like the SH in ship. And finally, the tau, one of the T sounds in Hebrew, it sounds like the T, as in toy. Those are the 23 letters or consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. You'll need to memorize the form, the name, and the pronunciation for each letter. At the end of this lecture, we'll go over how to write or produce each of these forms written out by hand. In addition to the 23 forms of the Hebrew alphabet that we just learned, 5 of those forms have an additional or final form. The final form of the letter is the form that that letter takes on when it appears in the final position of the word, at the end of the word. In the examples in the right column, you will see the final form of each with other letters. So there is the noun Derek. Because the kaf appears at the end of the word, the final form is used. If it were to appear at the beginning or the middle of the word, it would take the regular form, kaf. With the example am, because the mem appears at the end of the word, it appears as the final form and not the regular form that would appear at the beginning or middle of the word. Likewise with the word zakein, because the noon appears at the end of the word, it also will take the final form. In the same way, kesef or eretz, because the pei and the tzadeh appear at the end of the word, it uses the final form and not the medial or irregular forms that we see with noon, pei, and tzadeh. You will have to memorize each of the 5 final forms and be able to identify the fact that each one is related to the regular form. At the end of this lecture, we'll go over how to draw or write the 5 final forms. 6 of the letters in Hebrew have 2 possible pronunciations. There's a hard pronunciation and a soft pronunciation. These are the 6 Begad Kafat consonants. Now, the word Begad Kafat is going to sound strange to you, and it is strange. It's a made-up word. In fact, it's a mnemonic device. And a mnemonic device simply is a way of helping you to memorize which letters in the Hebrew alphabet are the Begad Kafat letters. If you say the word Begad Kafat, you'll recognize that the consonants in English are B, G, D, K, P, H, T, which relate to the Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Tau in Hebrew. So if you can say Begad Kafat, you'll know which letters are the Begad Kafat letters. Let's look at those together on the screen. You'll see 6 sets of examples. In each set, there are 2 letters. The first letter written with a dot, the second letter written without a dot. The dot that appears in a Begad Kafat consonant to distinguish its pronunciation is called the Dagesh Lene. The Dagesh Lene appears in a Begad Kafat consonant when it's indicating the hard pronunciation. Now by hard I mean that there's a full stop of air rather than air passing through the mouth to create the sound. Let's look at what I mean with the consonant Beit. Beit with the Dagesh Lene is pronounced with the hard B as in boy, ba. But Beit without the Dagesh Lene is pronounced with the soft V as in vine. There's more air that passes through your mouth with the V. There's a hard stop with B. Because of that, they'll call these or distinguish these as a hard and soft pronunciation. Let's look at Gimel. The Gimel with the Dagesh Lene is the hard G as in God, but the Gimel without the Dagesh Lene is the softer G as the GH in aghast or maybe the G in giant. The Dalet with the Dagesh Lene is pronounced with the hard D as in day. The Dalet without the Dagesh Lene is the DH sound as in the. The Kaf with the Dagesh Lene is the hard K sound as in king, but the Kaf without the Dagesh Lene is pronounced as CH, like the German word Bach. The Pei with the Dagesh Lene is the hard P as in pastor, but the Pei without the Dagesh Lene sounds like the PH in alphabet, or maybe F. The Tau with the Dagesh Lene is pronounced like the T in toy, but the Tau without the Dagesh Lene is the softer pronunciation, the TH in thin. you will need to memorize both the hard and the soft pronunciations for the Begad Gafat consonants. You'll also need to know that the hard sound is identified by the presence of a Dagesh Lene. The Dagesh Lene in the consonant identifies the hard sound of the Begad Gafat letter. In addition to 5 final forms and 6 Begad Gafat letters, Hebrew also has a group of consonants known as the guttural consonants. Hebrew has 4 guttural and 1 semi-guttural consonant. The 4 guttural consonants are Aleph, He, Chet, and Ayin. The 1 semi-guttural is Resh. For now, you don't need to know anything else about these consonants except that they are grouped together as gutturals. It will also be helpful to know that Aleph, He, Chet, and Ayin are full gutturals, but the Resh is the semi-guttural. And later, we'll learn some rules that apply to these guttural consonants. You'll understand that with any language, there are a variety of ways to pronounce the words in that language. Let's take English as an example. The pronunciation of English in America is different from the pronunciation of English in Australia, which is different from the pronunciation of English perhaps in Scotland or England. Pronunciation can change over time, and pronunciation can change by geography. Now, when we're studying biblical or classical Hebrew, we're studying a very old form of the language. But there's also modern or Israeli Hebrew. And modern Israeli Hebrew is not necessarily pronounced as traditional biblical classical Hebrew was pronounced. So there are a number of different ways in which some of these words can be pronounced. Some professors and instructors will prefer a traditional pronunciation system, and some professors will prefer a modern pronunciation system. It really doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. In this grammar, we're going to use the traditional or classical system of pronunciation. The reason for that is it's going to make paradigm memorization and verse memorization easier. There's nothing wrong with the modern pronunciation. This is just the system that we're going to use in this grammar. It's best just to use the system that the instructor uses and follow along in that case. Now, when it comes to the major differences between traditional and modern pronunciation, it's helpful to know a few of the major changes. Let's consider these together. First, in the traditional pronunciation, the gimel is distinguished with a hard and soft pronunciation. In the modern pronunciation, whether it has the Dagesh Lene or not, it's the hard G as in God. The same is true for Dalet and Tau. Whether it has the Dagesh Lene or not, in the modern pronunciation, it's always pronounced with the hard sound, like the D in day or the T in toy. Finally, with regard to the consonant that we call wow, in modern Hebrew, it's called a vav and pronounced like the V in vine. This is perhaps the most significant change of all the changes that we see. Now again, it doesn't matter which system you use, just as long as you pick one and are consistent with it. In this grammar, we'll use the traditional system. Now that we've covered the basic information about the Hebrew alphabet, the 23 forms, the names, the sounds, the Begad Gafat consonants, the final forms, and the guttural consonants, it comes time for us to learn how to write these letters, and this will take some practice. The first thing to understand is that when you write these letters, they're not going to look exactly like the printed letter, right? The printed letters in a modern English book don't look like your handwritten script. And from person to person, a handwritten script may be slightly different. I'm going to give you a good and basic starting point, and you may end up modifying a little bit to suit your own needs, or your instructor may have different suggestions for how to form different words. But this is at least one basic system that will allow you to get started and be consistent as you work on memorizing the Hebrew alphabet. We'll begin with Aleph and writing a backslash followed by 2 curved lines, a curved line on the top and a curved line on the bottom. Once again, backslash, curved line on the top, curved line on the bottom. Now in the second 2 examples, I'll provide you with another option for writing the letter. Backslash, and then 1 continuous curved line. Some people prefer to do it that way. Backslash, 1 continuous curved line. They both produce the same basic form, just pick one and be consistent with it. Next is bait. We're going to have a rounded angle and a base. A rounded angle and a base. 2 more times. a rounded angle with a base, and a rounded angle with a base. Because this is a Bagad-Kafad consonant, we'll put a nice big doggish forte in the letter to remind you of that. Now we come to Gimel, which is a wavy backslash with a leg to support it. A wavy backslash with a leg to support it. 2 more times. Watch with the wavy backslash and the leg to support it. The wavy backslash and the leg to support it. This is our second Bagad-Kafad consonant, so we must put a doggish lene in there to remind you of it. The Dalet. The Dalet is written as a right angle with a bit of a tail. We begin with a horizontal line and then a vertical line. A horizontal line, and then a vertical line. Notice that in each instance there's a little bit of an overhang on our line. This is a very important feature of the Dalet, and it will help distinguish the Dalet from other forms that we'll see. 2 more examples. The horizontal line and the vertical line, the horizontal line and the vertical line. And in each case, there's that overhang. The Dalet is our third Bagad-Kafad consonant, and so we're going to put a doggish lene in that form. Hey. Hey is a guttural consonant. The guttural hey is written as a right angle with another vertical line. A right angle and another vertical line. Notice that I've left space in each form to mimic the space in the printed form. 2 more examples. Right angle, vertical line. Right angle, vertical line. That's the hey. Now we come to the wow, or what in modern pronunciation is the vav. We're going to begin with a slight angle and then straight down. A slight angle and straight down. That angle mimics the angle that you see in the printed form. But some people prefer to simply write this particular consonant as a straight line, and that's fine too. Straight line, straight line. You can do either one, just pick one and be consistent. We now come to Zayin, a Z sound in Hebrew. And the Zayin consists of a long vertical line with a little hat that's tilted. A long vertical line with a hat that's tilted. 2 more examples. Watch. A long vertical line and the tilted hat. A long vertical line and the tilted hat. That's the Zayin. Chet. The chet can be written in a number of different ways. We'll begin the first 2 examples with a right angle, followed by a vertical line, a right angle, followed by a vertical line. Notice that there is no space between the right angle and the vertical line to distinguish it from the hey. This also mimics the fact that it's closed here. Now, in addition to the right angle with vertical line, we can write this with one continuous stroke where we write up and over and down. Up and over and down. It looks like a rectangle without a base. Either of those systems are fine, just pick one and be consistent. We now come to the tet, one of the T sounds in Hebrew, and it's written almost as a circle with a backslash at the top there. Again, almost as a circle, and then bring that in. That final line mimics the fact that the consonant dips back into the circle in its writing. 2 more examples. We'll begin our circle, and before we close it, back into the line. Begin our circle, before we close it, back in. That's the tet. The yod is the smallest of the Hebrew letters, and so far you'll observe that we have taken up 2 spaces or 2 lines to write each of our letters. The yod is only going to take up the top half of that space. The yod will be written simply as a curved angle, yod. Again down here, yod and yod. It might be helpful to consider it with the consonant chet that we just practiced. There's the chet, it takes up 2 spaces, but the yod only takes up 1. That gives you a basic spatial orientation to the size of that particular consonant. The yod is the smallest of the letters. Kaf. Kaf is written like a backwards C. Very easy. Cough. A backwards C. Two more. Backwards C and backwards C. It's our fourth Bagad Kafad consonant, so we're going to put a doggish lane in the cough. Lamed. Lamed is the largest of the Hebrew letters. In fact, in Hebrew manuscripts, you can always see the lameds on a page because they go way above the line. So if we normally write in two spaces, the lamed is going to start above the normal spot and then come down and look like a lightning bolt. So we begin one space up, lightning bolt, and down. One space up, lightning bolt, and down. And if you think that's an over-exaggeration, look up a Hebrew manuscript online and you'll see that this is the truth with regard to the size of the lamed. Its top stroke is very large. That's the lamed, the lightning bolt lamed. Next we come to the mem, the M sound in Hebrew. There are a number of different ways to describe how this particular character is written. The first way will be like a giant wave with a surfer. Or it can be a giant mountain with a mountain climber. Or it can be a house with a chimney. Either way, memorize the form and be consistent. The noon looks very much like a backwards L. I normally begin with a small angled line, followed by a vertical line down to the base, and then the base line. Angled line, straight line, base line. Now, like the wow, some people may prefer not to do the angled line at the top, and that's fine. You can make it look simply like a backwards L. Straight down and over. Straight down and over. Either form is fine. The top one is a little fancier. The bottom one is perhaps a little simpler and quicker to draw. The Samic. The Samic looks like a backwards sigma. What it is, it's a big circle with a little hat. A big circle with a little hat. Two more examples. Big circle, give it the hat, and big circle, and give it the hat. The Samic looks like a backwards sigma if you've had Greek. Ayin. The ayin is a guttural consonant, and it looks very much like the English letter Y. We're going to begin at the top here and angle down, and then run that base line, and then connect it like a Y. All the way down to the base, run it along the base, connect it to look like a Y. Two more examples, all the way to the base, connect it. All the way to the base, and connect it. That's the ayin, or one of the guttural consonants in Hebrew. Next it's pei, and because it's a Bagad Kafad consonant, let's put a doggish lane in it, just to remember that. And let's draw it. We're going to draw a big backwards C, and then N at the top. A big backwards C, and then N at the top. This stroke that brings it in at the top mimics this stroke here that brings the line inside the consonant. A backwards C and N. Some people prefer to start at the top and come out and then over and around. Either way is fine. Just pick the system that works best for you and be consistent and as neat as possible. Tzadeh. Tzadeh is formed by making a backslash to the base, running the line in the opposite direction on the base, and then connecting it midway down with an angled line. Backslash, run it down the base, connect it with the arm. Backslash, run it along the base, connect it with the arm. One more, backslash, run it along the base, connect the arm. That's the tzadeh, the TS sound in Hebrew. Kof. Kof is a consonant that goes slightly below the line when you draw it, and it looks like a P. So we're going to come vertically down and go a little bit below the line, and then finish out the symbol that makes it look like a P. All the way down a little below the line, and then finish it out with a symbol that makes it look like a P. All the way down, curved line, all the way down, curved line. This is the kof. It's similar to the P in English, but not exactly like that, and it goes below the line. That's the kof. The resh. is another one of the gutturals, and it's easy to draw. It's written as a rounded angle from the top, rounded and down. From the top, rounded and down. It's important to render the resh with the angled line because it will help distinguish it from the dalet, which has the sharp line with the overhang. One more time, angled line, resh. Be careful to distinguish between the resh and the dalet. Sin. The sin is written as a wide U with an angled line inside that U and a dot over the left arm. A wide U, an angled line within that U, and a dot over the left arm. Two more. Wide U, angled line, dot, wide U, angled line, dot. That's the sin. The shin is made in the exact same way, wide U, angled line, but the dot's over the right. Wide U, angled line, dot over the right. Let's look below at the sin again. It's a wide U, an angled line, but the dot's over to the left. You can see the difference between the sin and the shin because with the shin, the dots are on the right side of the consonant, but with the sin, the dot is on the left side of the consonant. That's the Hebrew letter shin. Finally, there is tau. And tau can be written in a number of different ways, and I'll give you two of them. You can begin with a right angle, and then come back and do a vertical line with a foot. A right angle, and then a vertical line with a foot. Or you can do it in one continuous stroke. Up, down, over, up. Up, down, over, up. Doesn't matter which way you do it, as long as you're consistent in your rendering of the tau. And that will help you to distinguish between the he, the chet, and the tau, because they all look like rectangles without a base. But you'll recall that the he has space here, and the chet does not have the foot. In fact, let me erase those two forms at the bottom and write the he and the chet in context just so you can see the differences. The he is the right angle with a vertical line and space between the right angle and the vertical line. The chet, however, is the same right angle with a vertical line but no space. Again, notice that the space here identifies the he, and the fact that there's no foot here identifies the chet or distinguishes it from the tau. The tau is the last of the 6 Begad Kafat letters, so once again, we're going to add the Dagesh Lene to the tau to remind us that it's a Begad Kafat letter. We've now finished drawing the 23 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but before we end, let's look at the 5 final forms that are written differently than the medial forms or the regular form. The first one is Kaf. The regular Kaf is written as a backwards C. The final Kaf is written as a horizontal line with a vertical line that descends below the line of the Kaf. It looks like a dalet with a long leg. You'll see here that the regular Kaf and the final Kaf have different forms, and the final Kaf is on the left. Mem. The regular mem looks like that wave with the surfer. The final mem is more square. So we're going to come down, over, and back up. That mimics the final form we see on the printed page. Once again, it's a little tough. We're going to do down, over, and up. That's the final form of the mem. The nun. The regular nun consists of a small angled line, a vertical line, and then a base line. The final form of the nun has that same angled line, but a straight line that descends below the line with which it was previously stopped. So the nun looks like a long wow, you could think of it that way, or the fact that the regular nun has had its leg stretched down further south. The pei. The regular pei is written like a backwards C with an internal line. The final pei is written the same way, but its leg descends again below the line. You can see there's some similarity in form there between the regular pei and the final pei. The final pei has had that bottom line stretched. Sade. The regular Sade appears as an angled line, a baseline, and an arm. The final Sade does not get that baseline. It just continues below the line, and then you get the regular arm. Again, it's been stretched. It looks like a backwards Y. That concludes the 5 final forms that you must learn to write. So what must you do before you move on from this chapter? First, memorize the 23 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet in order. Be able to write out the alphabet completely from right to left. You should also know the name and pronunciation of each letter. Memorize the 5 final forms, the 6 Begad Kafat consonants and their pronunciation values, and the 4.5 guttural consonants. This chapter will take some time to master. You want to be careful and neat and clean when you write out each of the Hebrew letters. Consistency and clarity will help you learn the alphabet quickly. Also, every time you write out a letter, you should pronounce its name. That way you can associate the name and the form in your mind more often, and that will help you to memorize each of the letters. The first thing I have my students do on their quiz for this chapter is write out the 23 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. Then they have to go back and put a dagesh lene in the 6 Begad Kafat consonants. After that, they have to underline the 4.5 guttural consonants, and then they have to write the 5 final forms underneath the regular forms. And if you can practice in this way, you'll be able to master all of the different components and features of the alphabet that are required, and in this way you'll master the material from chapter 1. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 2, the Hebrew Vowels. In Chapter 1, we learned the Hebrew alphabet, and the Hebrew alphabet consists of 23 consonants, no vowels. The vowel system in Hebrew is not a part of the alphabet. Rather, it's its own system of pointing symbols that we're going to learn in this chapter. In this lecture, we will cover the system of Hebrew vowel symbols. These vowels occur in long, short, and reduced vowel categories. There are also vowel letters. We will also include the topics of defective writing, the shawah, and the dagesh forte. We'll begin by looking at the text from Deuteronomy 6:5. In this first example, we'll see that there are no vowels in the Hebrew text. It is simply a line of consonants. In the second example, we'll see that Hebrew vowels have been added to those consonants. There are no change in the consonants. There is no change in the length of line. The vowel symbols were designed in order to be added to the consonantal text without intruding on the consonants. You'll observe that most of the vowels appear below the consonant with which they are associated. Some vowels will appear inside the consonant, and a very few vowels may appear over the consonant. This is the system of Hebrew vowels that we will learn in this chapter, how all of these dots and dashes and points help us to pronounce or vocalize the Hebrew text. Just for fun, let me pronounce Deuteronomy 6:5 for you. Wa'ahavta, 8th, Yahweh Elohecha, b'chol levavecha. Now I knew how to pronounce those consonants because of the vowels that appeared with them. It's also important to understand that you're going to pronounce each vowel after the consonant. So in some sense, you'll be moving your eyes down and up between consonants and vowels, and this may give your eyes a little bit of a strain at first. But over time, you'll become very quick at reading the Hebrew text. Let's begin with vowel chart 1, the long vowels in Hebrew. They appear in the A class, the E class, and the O class. And the very first thing we want to do is we want to pronounce each vowel symbol with the consonant bait. Let's begin. Ba, be, and bo. Once again, ba, be, and bo. The long A-class vowel, comets, appears as a T under the consonant and is pronounced like the A in father. The long E vowel, tsere, appears as 2 horizontal dots under the consonant and is pronounced like the E in they. The long O-class vowel, holum, appears over and to the left of the consonant and is pronounced like the O in roll. Once again, let's say these vowels together with the consonant bait. Ba, bay, and bo. Those are the long vowels from vowel chart 1. We now move on to vowel chart 2 with the short vowels. With the short vowels, there are A, E, I, O, and U class vowels. Let's begin by pronouncing each of those vowels with the consonant bait. Ba, be, bi, ba, boo. Once again, ba, be, bi, ba, boo. The pathic is the short A vowel, and it appears as a small horizontal stroke under the consonant. It's pronounced like the A in bat. The sagol is the short E class vowel, and it appears as a series of 3 dots under the consonant. It's pronounced like the E as in better. Hirik is the short I class vowel, and it appears as a single dot under the consonant, and it's pronounced like the I in bitter. Kamatatuf is the short O class vowel, and like the comets, it appears as a small T underneath the consonant, and it's pronounced like the O in bottle. Finally, the kibbutz is the short U class vowel, and it appears as a series of 3 diagonal dots under the consonant, and it's pronounced like the U in ruler. Let's pronounce these vowels again with the consonant bait. Ba, be, bi, ba, boo. These are the short vowels from vowel chart 2. Let's move to vowel chart 3 where we come to the reduced or super short vowels. There are A, E, and O class vowels in this category, and we'll begin by pronouncing each with the consonant bait. Ba, be, ba. Once again, ba, be, ba. The Hatef pathic is the reduced A class vowel, and it appears as a horizontal stroke on the left with 2 vertical dots on the right. In fact, you'll observe that in each of the reduced vowels, there are 2 vertical dots on the right of each vowel symbol from the short vowel class. The Hatef pathic is pronounced like the A in amuse, a very short vowel. The Hatef sagol appears as a series of 3 dots with the 2 vertical dots on the right, and is pronounced like the E in metallic. The Hatef comets appears as a small T with 2 vertical dots on the right underneath the consonant, and is pronounced like the O in commit. Let's pronounce these vowels again with a consonant bait. Ba, be, ba. These are the reduced or super short vowels from vowel chart 3. We now come to the summary vowel chart where we list all of the long, short, and reduced vowels in Hebrew. This chart at a glance serves to show you what each vowel symbol looks like and where each vowel symbol appears with the consonant. Notice that all of the vowels appear underneath the consonant with which they're associated, except for the long O class vowel, holum, which appears over and to the left. Before you move on from this chapter, you're going to need to be able to write each of the vowel symbols. You're going to need to know the name and the pronunciation value for each of those symbols. Also the class and the type for each vowel, whether it's long, short, reduced, or an A, E, I, O, and U vowel. Additionally, it will be helpful to know that some vowels are related one to another. All of the A class vowels are related to each other, and so you have the long A, the short A, and the reduced A. Knowing that these 3 vowels are related will help us later on when we encounter them in words. Additionally, all of the E and I class vowels are also related one to another. You have the long E, the short E, and the reduced E, and the short I. But all of these vowels are related and go together in certain categories. Additionally, the O and U class vowels are related in terms of long, short, and reduced O, and then the short U. So this little subgrouping between A, E, I, and then O, U is a helpful way to memorize some of these vowels and symbols and to classify them. In addition to the regular vowel symbols that we just studied, Hebrew also has a set of vowel letters. Vowel letters consist of a vowel written with a letter or a consonant. That's why they're called vowel letters. And there are three types of vowel letters in Hebrew: those written with hey, those written with waw, and those written with yod. We'll study each of those now. We'll begin with vowel letters written with hey, and they appear in three different classes: A class, E class, and O class. And let's begin by pronouncing them, each with the consonant bait. Ba, be, be, and bo. You'll notice that each of these vowel letters are pronounced just like the regular vowels that they're associated with. For example, the comet's hey appears as the comet's vowel under the bait, followed by hey, and is pronounced just like the regular comets, the A in father. The sere hey appears as a sere followed by hey, and is pronounced like the regular sere, like the E in they. The sagol hey appears as a sagol under the consonant, and is pronounced just like the regular sagol, the E as in better. And finally, the holum hey appears as a holum over and to the left of the consonant, followed by the hey, and is pronounced just like the regular holum, O as in roll. When it comes to vowel letters written with hey, it's important to understand that vowel letters written with hey are only used at the end of a word, as in the example Torah. There you see the comet's hey at the end of the word. You'll never see a vowel letter written with hey at the beginning or in the middle of a word. Before we move on from this slide, you'll observe that the name of each vowel letter is a combination of the regular vowel plus the consonant. So comets plus hey is comet's hey, or tsere plus hey is tsere hey. So it shouldn't be difficult to memorize the names or even the sounds of these forms. It's just like the regular vowels that we have previously studied. We now turn to the study of vowel letters written with waw, and here we have the O class vowel and the U class vowel. Let's begin by pronouncing them with the consonant bait. Bo and boo. Once again, bo and boo. The holum waw is the unchangeable long O class vowel, and it's pronounced like the O as in roll. It appears as a holum over the waw, and therefore it's holum waw. The U class vowel, shurik, is pronounced like the U as in ruler, and it appears as a waw with a dot to the left. This is not a doggish forte, this is not a doggish lene, it's the shurik. And the shurik is the only vowel letter whose name is not a combination of the consonant and the vowel. When it comes to vowel letters written with holum waw, it's important to know that vowel letters written with waw are often referred to as unchangeable long vowels because they do not change or reduce. They're stable and stubborn. Remember them that way. Finally, we'll move to vowel letters written with yod. There's the E class and the I class. We'll begin by pronouncing each of them with the consonant bait. Be, be, bi. Once again, be, be, bi. The sere yod is a combination of sere and yod, and is pronounced like the sere, like the E in they. The sagol yod is a combination of sagol and yod, as the name suggests, and is pronounced like the E in better. Finally, the hirik yod is a combination of yes, the hirik and the yod, and is pronounced like the I in machine. Once again, each of these vowel letters have names that are a combination of the vowel and the consonant that follows, and they sound very much like the regular vowel that is associated with them. Once again, the pronunciation, be, be, and bi. Like vowel letters written with waw, vowel letters written with yod are often referred to as unchangeable long vowels because, like vowel letters written with waw, they do not change or reduce. They are often stubborn. So vowel letters written with hey appear only at the end of a word, and vowel letters written with waw do not change or reduce. They are unchangeable long vowels. Here we see a summary vowel chart of the vowel letters all together so that you can see the form, the class, and the category for each and how they're written. we see that they appear in the A, E, I, O, and U classes, written with hey, wow, or yod. Once again, certain vowels are related. A class vowels go together, I and E class vowels go together, and O and U class vowels go together. That's perhaps a way to break up the memorization process for these vowel letters. In terms of names, the one vowel that will need special attention is the unchangeable long vowel shurik that appears in the U class. This vowel is not a combination of the vowel and the consonant with which it occurs. It has its own special name, shurik. It's a very common vowel in the Hebrew Bible, and you're going to see it often. Now, when it comes to vowels and vowel letters, we need to consider the topic of defective writing. Oftentimes, vowel letters are written without their vowel letter. When a vowel letter is written without its vowel letter, we call it defective writing. It's defective because the vowel letter is written without the letter. In the three examples below, we show you the three patterns of defective writing. In the first example, we see the word shofar written with the holem wow vowel letter. It is defectively written as holem, again shofar. There's no change in pronunciation and there's no change in meaning. This is simply two different ways for spelling the word. The form with the vowel letter is designated as full writing or full spelling, and the form without the vowel letter is labeled as defective writing or defective spelling. And the first pattern is holem wow to holem. In our second example, madua, we see the shurik vowel letter written defectively as madua with kibbutz in the adjoining example. In each case, the words are pronounced the same and there's no change in meaning. You just need to understand that the shurik vowel letter may be written defectively as kibbutz. Finally, in our third example, we have dawid, and the hirik yod vowel letter is written in the adjoining example as dawid with hirik rather than hirik yod. The pronunciation is the same, the meaning is the same. You simply need to understand that the hirik yod vowel letter may be written defectively as hirik. There's no change in pronunciation and there's no change in meaning. These are the three patterns of defective writing for the vowel letters. Defective writing occurs frequently in the Hebrew Bible, and so you'll quickly become comfortable with seeing it. Now that we've covered the basic vowel symbols and vowel letters, there are a couple of other points of spelling that we need to talk about. The first is the shawah. The shawah appears as two vertical dots underneath the consonant. The shawah does not belong to any vowel class. The shawah does not belong to any vowel type. And there are two basic types of shawah: silent shawah and vocal shawah. The silent shawah has a zero value and is never pronounced. The vocal shawah maintains a quick, hurried pronunciation. In the next chapter, we will learn how to distinguish between the silent shawah and the vocal shawah. For now, you simply need to memorize what the shawah looks like, two vertical dots under the consonant, and the fact that there are two types of shawah, the silent shawah and the vocal shawah. The last symbol for us to discuss is the dagesh forte. The red dot in the consonant to the left is called the dagesh forte. We'll identify it here with the blue arrow. The dagesh forte and the dagesh lene are identical. They both appear as a dot inside of the consonant. The dagesh forte, however, doubles the consonant in which it appears. The dagesh lene hardens a bagad kafad consonant. The dagesh forte doubles the consonant. So if we were to render this example on the left-hand side of the page, a kof with a dagesh forte, we would render it as kof, kof, or two kofs. The dagesh forte may appear in any consonant except the gutturals, and in the next chapter we will learn how to distinguish between the dagesh forte and the dagesh lene. For now, you simply need to know that the dagesh forte, like the dagesh lene, appears as a dot in a consonant, and it doubles the consonant in which it appears. Don't worry about distinguishing it from the dagesh lene at this point. We'll cover that in the next chapter. So before you move on, what you need to know and do. First, memorize the name, vowel class, vowel type, and pronunciation for each vowel symbol and vowel letter. Second, know the difference between the full and defective writing of vowel letters and the three patterns of defective writing. Third, memorize the form of the shawah and the fact that it can be either silent or vocal. Finally, memorize the form and function of the dagesh forte. For most of us, the system of Hebrew vowel points is unlike anything we've ever encountered. For that reason, it may take a little bit of extra time to master this system. However, it's very important that you memorize each of the vowels with precision, both in terms of their form and position and pronunciation value. Do not move on to the next chapter until this chapter has been mastered. The first 3 chapters in this grammar, the alphabet, the vowels, and syllabification coming up, are perhaps the most difficult chapters in all of the grammar. So take your time. In fact, you may even want to repeat or rehearse this information 2 or 3 times before you move on. If you do it well in these first 3 chapters, the rest of the grammar will be that much easier. So I encourage you to invest wisely in chapters 1, 2, and 3. And that concludes our lecture for chapter 2, the Hebrew vowels. Welcome to the lectures for Basics of Biblical Hebrew chapter 3, and the topic is syllabification. Now, before we get into this chapter, I just want to make a brief comment about the nature of learning Hebrew and what's involved. Hebrew, because of the way in which it's written, the consonants and the vowels, and the way in which it's spelled throughout in terms of how things are added to words and the way in which words change their spelling, it's very important that we learn the system of consonants and vowels and how syllables work with precision. It's also probably one of the hardest things to do in biblical Hebrew. In fact, I would say that these first 3 chapters are the hardest chapters in all of the book. Once we get out of this, it's going to get progressively easier as we move through the grammar, which means don't be discouraged by the work that we have to do in these first 3 chapters, especially in chapter 3 here. If you get this material down well, the rest of your study of Hebrew is going to go so much easier and be so much better that you'll really feel the payoff. So that means we've got to invest carefully in memorizing the consonants, we've got to invest carefully in memorizing the vowels, and we've got to invest carefully in knowing how those consonants and vowels interact together. And that's called syllabification, and that's chapter 3. In this chapter, we're going to cover the 2 basic syllable rules for Hebrew, only 2 rules. We're going to talk about syllable classification and the accent mark. We're finally going to learn how to distinguish between the Dagesh forte and the Dagesh lene in a Begad Kafat consonant. We'll learn how to distinguish between the silent schwa and the vocal schwa. We'll also learn how to distinguish between the kametz, the long A, and the kametz hatuf, the short O. So there's going to be a lot of precision work done in this chapter and learn how to distinguish between things that are identical but have differing values. And finally, we'll cover the topic of the furtive pathic, the quiescent aleph, Hebrew diphthongs, and vowel preferences in Hebrew syllables. All of these topics are very important, and the better we learn them here, the easier Hebrew will be later for us. First, let's look at the 2 basic rules for syllabification in Hebrew. The first is that every syllable must begin with 1 consonant and have only 1 vowel. That's a very easy rule to memorize. Every Hebrew syllable must begin with 1 consonant and have only 1 vowel. Let's look at the example together from Davar. On the left, you see it's written in black and there's no syllable divider in it. On the right, you'll see that the word is divided and it consists of 2 syllables, da and var. The first syllable, da, begins with 1 consonant, dalet, and has only 1 vowel, kametz. The second syllable, var, also begins with 1 consonant, the bait, and has only 1 vowel, the kametz. Each syllable follows Rule 1 above, that every syllable must begin with 1 consonant and have only 1 vowel. Rule 2 is that there are only 2 types of syllables in Hebrew, open and closed. Open syllables end with a vowel, and closed syllables end with a consonant. It's that easy. If we look at our example again, you'll see that the first syllable, da, it begins with a consonant, dalet, and has only 1 vowel, kametz, and there is no consonant that closes it off. So there's a consonant and a vowel, so that syllable is open because it terminates or ends in a kametz or a vowel. Our second syllable, var, it is a closed syllable because it begins with a consonant, it has a vowel, but then it finishes up with a consonant. So it's closed because it terminates with a consonant. So what are our 2 rules? 1, every syllable must begin with 1 consonant and have only 1 vowel. And there are only 2 types of syllables, open and closed. An open syllable ends with a vowel, and a closed syllable ends with a consonant. It's that easy. These two rules are simple to memorize, but they are vitally important because they will help you to syllabify Hebrew words as we progress through the chapter. Let's consider the topic of word accent in Hebrew. Look at your screens with me. Hebrew words are normally accented on the last syllable. So in our example here, davar, the syllable that appears in red is the accented syllable. So you need to understand that in Hebrew, a word is normally accented on the last syllable. And so in this grammar, we won't be marking words when they're accented on the final syllable. We're just going to assume that you understand, unless it's marked otherwise, the word is going to have its accent on the final syllable. However, some Hebrew words are accented on the second to the last syllable. There are only two options in Hebrew for a word accent, either the last syllable or the second to the last syllable. In this grammar, if a syllable is accented on the second to the last syllable, then we're going to mark it with the Hebrew accent mark, and you can see that here in blue. It appears as that small mathematical less than sign over the consonant of the syllable that it marks. So if we were going to divide this syllable, we would divide it right down the line here between the mem and the lamed. And we see in this particular word, because it's accented on the second to the last syllable, we're going to mark it with the accent mark. That's the accent mark in Hebrew. Now, you need to know this. When you begin to look at the Hebrew Bible itself, you're going to see that there are dozens of different types of accent marks. In order to avoid all that confusion, we have just created one accent mark for this particular grammar, and it's the standard convention in the literature when we see journal articles or commentaries written and they're going to mark this particular accent. This is the way in which they do it. When you get into the biblical text, however, you're going to see that there's a greater variety of forms and functions for these accent marks, but that's something to learn in Hebrew 3, not Hebrew 1 or Hebrew 2. So we have these words with syllables, and then we need to talk about then syllable classification. You've already heard me talk about the last syllable and the second to the last syllable, but there's a more sophisticated way of talking about these syllables, and it's tonic, pretonic, and propretonic. Now, if you look at the examples on the page here, you're going to see red and blue and black syllables. A tonic syllable is the accented syllable in a word, and so you can see in our three examples, the end of each word appears in red because it's the tonic syllable or the accented syllable. The syllable that appears before the tonic syllable is called the pretonic syllable. It's called pretonic because it's before the tonic syllable. And those syllables appear in blue in each of the three examples. Then there is the propretonic syllable. A propretonic syllable is any syllable that appears before the pretonic syllable. And all of those appear in black in the examples below, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. So in terms of syllable classification, we're going to have the tonic or accented syllable, the pretonic syllable that occurs before the accented syllable, and then the propretonic syllable that appears before the pretonic syllable. In a word, you will only have one tonic syllable and one pretonic syllable, but you can have several propretonic syllables. So let's look at these examples together. You can see in our first example, davar, the red syllable is tonic and the blue syllable is pretonic because it occurs or appears before the tonic syllable. In our second example, davarim, the red syllable is the tonic or accented syllable, the blue syllable is the pretonic syllable, and then the black syllable is the propretonic syllable because it occurs before the pretonic syllable. In our last example, this is the Hebrew word for the proper noun Nebuchadnezzar. It's a nice long word, so it will show you. We have our tonic syllable at the end, our pretonic syllable right before that, and then we have three propretonic syllables, 1, 2, 3. This is the system of syllable classification that you need to learn for mastering how syllables work in Hebrew. Tonic, pretonic, and propretonic. The names themselves are descriptive of where those syllables occur in terms of where they appear with regard to the accent. It's the accent that drives the meaning of these names, and it's the accent and the position of the accent that's going to really drive the train in terms of what vowels appear in what words and how things will change. Let's look now at the Dagesh and Abagad Kafat consonant. You've learned that when you see a dot in a Hebrew letter, it can have one of two values. It can be a Dagesh forte or a Dagesh lene. Now, a Dagesh lene appears only in the 6 Begad Kafat consonants, and it identifies the hard pronunciation in that Begad Kafat consonant. The Dagesh forte can appear in any consonant except for a guttural consonant, and it doubles the consonant in which it appears. Now, because the Begad Kafat consonants are not gutturals, when you have a Dagesh in a Begad Kafat consonant, it can be either Dagesh forte, doubling the sound, or it can be a Dagesh lene, hardening the sound. How do you tell the difference? Once again, by way of review, a Dagesh lene can occur only in a Begad Kafat consonant. A Dagesh forte can occur in any consonant except the gutturals and resh, and this means that the Begad Kafat consonant can take either a Dagesh forte or a Dagesh lene. So then how can you tell the difference? Here's how you tell the difference. A Dagesh in a Begad Kafat consonant is a forte if it is preceded by a vowel. In all other circumstances, it is a lene. So let's take a look at our example below to make sure we understand. Here we have a Dagesh in the pei for the word hapar, the bull. We now need to decide, is this a Dagesh forte, doubling the consonant, or is it a Dagesh lene, hardening the consonant? We look at the letter before it, and if there's a vowel associated with it, it's a Dagesh forte. If there's no vowel before it, it's a Dagesh lene. It's that simple. You also need to understand that when a Dagesh forte doubles a Begad Kafat consonant, it doubles the hard sound, not the soft sound. A Dagesh in a Begad Kafat consonant is a lene if it is preceded by a consonant. So if it's preceded by a vowel, it's a forte. If it's preceded by a consonant, it's a lene. So look at our example here, Malka, queen. You will see that there's a Dagesh in the kaf following the lamed. How do you tell if that's a Dagesh lene, hardening the sound, or a Dagesh forte, doubling the hard sound? You look at the letter before it and the vowel associated with it. Because we have a schwa here, we know that that is not a vowel. That's a zero vowel. It's a syllable closer. Because there's no vowel before the consonant with the Dagesh in it, that Begad Kafat consonant, we know then that it must be a Dagesh lene. The Dagesh in the kaf is a lene because it is immediately preceded by a consonant, not a vowel. A Dagesh in a Begad Kafat consonant is a lene if it appears also at the beginning of a word. So if you look at this final example down here, davar, we're looking at the dalet, which is a Begad Kafat consonant. It has a dot in it, a Dagesh. Is it a Dagesh forte or a Dagesh lene? Well, it's its own new word. So there's no vowel before it, so it must be a Dagesh lene. Or you can think of it this way. Whenever a Begad Kafat consonant begins a word and there's a Dagesh in it, it's always going to be Dagesh lene. Now that we know how to distinguish between a Dagesh forte and a Dagesh lene, how do we distinguish between a vocal and a silent schwa? Let's review what the schwa actually is. Look at your screens with me. A schwa, as you know, does not belong to any vowel class, A, E, I, O, or U. And the schwa does not belong to any vowel type, long, short, or reduced. There are two basic types of schwa, the silent schwa and the vocal schwa. The silent schwa has a zero value and is never pronounced. The vocal schwa maintains a quick, hurried pronunciation, very much like the hatef vowels. So how do you distinguish between the silent schwa and the vocal schwa? Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to distinguish between the silent schwa and the vocal schwa. A schwa is silent when immediately preceded by a short vowel. In all other circumstances, it is vocal. So if you're just going to memorize one rule for the schwa to distinguish between vocal and silent, this is the rule. If the schwa is immediately preceded by a short vowel, it is silent. In all other circumstances, it is vocal. Well, again, let's look at our example, Malka, queen, and you'll see that there is a red schwa under the lamed. You'll also observe that it's immediately preceded by the short vowel, pathic, the short A-class vowel. This schwa is silent then because it is immediately preceded by a short vowel, the pathic. In any other environment, it's going to be a vocal schwa, and it really is that easy. Now we're going to look at some other circumstances that may be potentially confusing, but this is the rule that governs all the other rules. Silent schwa part 2. The first of two contiguous or side-by-side schwas within a word is silent. The second one will be vocal. So let's look at our example down here, and you'll observe that in this word there are two schwas in the middle of the word. Whenever you have two schwas side by side together like that in the middle of the word, the first one is always silent. You can confirm that by looking at the vowel before it, and you see that short I-class vowel, heeric. Because it appears before a short vowel, it must be silent. You can also doubly confirm the status of this next schwa because it does not appear before a short vowel, so it must be vocal. Now, a schwa at the end of the word, as in our second example here, is silent. In fact, this particular environment is not that common, but whenever you have two schwas at the end of a word, think of them both as silent. Now, this only appears in one particular word, in one particular form. So you just need to be aware of that when we get to it, and I'll mention it again when we get to it, but it's kind of a sub-rule of this one. You will see two schwas at the end of a word together, but they're both going to be silent. But if you have two schwas together in the middle of a word, the first one will always be silent, the second one vocal. How about the vocal schwa? Well, just remember that rule, that a schwa is going to be silent if it immediately preceded by a short vowel, and in all other circumstances, vocal. Therefore, a schwa at the beginning of a word is always vocal because it is not immediately preceded by a short vowel. In fact, it's not preceded by anything but space. And so next, the second of two contiguous or side-by-side schwas within a word must be vocal. It's the same thing that we just studied. If you've got two schwas within a word, the first one will be silent, the second vocal. The second one will be preceded by the silent schwa, not a vowel, so by definition it must be vocal, which means you're just learning that one rule and different applications in different contexts. And finally, the third one, a schwa after a long vowel is normally vocal. Now remember, the rule is this. If the schwa is immediately preceded by a short vowel, it's going to be silent. If it's preceded by any other thing, whether a consonant or a long vowel, it's going to be vocal. So here in our example, kothavim, we have a long holum vowel preceding the schwa. Now, because the holum is a long vowel, that schwa is not immediately preceded by a short vowel. Because it's not immediately preceded by a short vowel, then it must be a vocal schwa. So when you're looking at these schwas in context, not only do you have to define the vowel, but you have to know if it's a long vowel or a short vowel. If it's preceded by the short vowel, silent. If it's preceded by a long vowel or a consonant, it'll be vocal. Now, those rules are easy to think about in terms of memorizing them, but it does get tricky in context, and we'll practice together. Let's consider one more aspect of the vocal schwa here in vocal schwa part 2. The appearance of a schwa under a consonant with a dogish forte is a little bit tricky, let's say. Consider the example, Hem Melachim, the kings. Now, we've got two things going on here in the mem that you see highlighted as red. First, we see that that mem has a dogish forte in it, and then we see that it has a schwa under it. So what happens when your consonant has a dogish forte in it? Well, that dogish forte doubles everything, the consonant and the schwa, you could say. The dogish forte doubles the consonant and the schwa. Therefore, we're going to render this single mem dogish forte with a schwa as two mems with two schwas below. That means that now we are applying the rule you have two schwas within a word. The first one will then be silent, and the second one will be vocal. And that's true because it follows the pathic, so it's immediately preceded by a short vowel, so it follows the rules. The tricky thing is that simply when you see it, so what you're looking at is you're kind of looking at a blown up version that this dogish forte in that big giant mem on the right is really doubling both the consonant and the schwa. So it's going to actually have a silent schwa and a vocal schwa aspect to it. That's probably the trickiest part of this chapter, is how to render that dogish forte with that schwa. It doubles the consonant mem and it doubles the schwa. It will give you both a silent schwa and a vocal schwa. Now there are two ways of rendering that when you syllabify. You could simply draw a vertical line through the whole complex, the mem, the dagesh, and the schwa, and that way you know everything's getting doubled like that. Or you could do what we've done over here to the left, where you could draw both the mem and the schwas twice. Either way is acceptable, and then when you syllabify, you would just run your line through the two mems. I guess one of the things that's going to be important to consider is that whenever you see a schwa in Hebrew, whether it is vocal schwa or silent schwa, you're going to want to syllabify right after it. So if you see something like this where you've got two schwas in it, really, you're going to have to draw the line straight through the middle or render it twice. So now we know how to distinguish between a dagesh forte and a dagesh lene in a begad kafat. And we also know how to distinguish between a silent schwa and a vocal schwa in a word. Next, we need to consider how do we distinguish between a kametz and a kametz hatuf. Now, both the kametz and the kametz hatuf have the exact same symbol, and they're very similar in pronunciation value, and that's probably why they have the same symbol. But how do you know if it's a short O, like ah, or the long A, as in almost the same, ah? Very similar in their pronunciation. Here's the rule. Are you ready for this? The kametz hatuf can occur only in one particular environment. The kametz hatuf will occur only in a closed, unaccented syllable. Let's look at our example together, chokmah. This first syllable, chok, is closed and unaccented. Because of that, I know the kametz underneath the chet is a kametz hatuf, a short O, because the syllable is closed and unaccented. But I also see a kametz or a kametz hey here, and that's a long A vowel, because it's in an accented syllable. The kametz hatuf can only occur in a closed, unaccented syllable. In every other syllable, it'll be a kametz. The kametz prefers an open pretonic syllable or a closed accented syllable, but never a closed unaccented syllable. So you just need to remember the one environment in which the kametz hatuf can occur, closed and unaccented, and then you'll know that everything else is a kametz. Now, if you had to guess, always guess kametz, because there are many, many more kametzes in Hebrew than there are kametz hatufs. But you don't want to be unsophisticated. You want to know how to tell the difference between kametz and kametz hatuf. And here's the one rule. Kametz hatuf can appear in a closed, unaccented syllable. In all other instances, it'll be kametz. Thankfully, there's this mark called the metheg that may be used to identify the kametz. It is a small vertical stroke that appears to the left of the symbol. Whenever you have this small vertical stroke to the left of the symbol, it will identify the kametz or long A vowel. It's like its own syllable divider. It's helping you to syllabify a word. So watch out for that little mark. It's the metheg, and it identifies the kametz. Furtive pathic. You have learned that the pathic is a short A-class vowel that appears under a consonant and is pronounced after that consonant. There is, however, a special use of the pathic known as the furtive pathic. The furtive pathic appears with the gutturals chet and ayin at the end of the word when the preceding vowel is not an A-class. Now, the reason for that is that gutturals love A-class vowels. And so whenever they're in an environment where there's not an A-class vowel, they like to shift the vowels around to get an A-class vowel with them. Additionally, these guttural consonants are weak in their pronunciation value, and so when they appear at the end of a word, there's the danger of them not being pronounced. By adding the furtive pathic, we're ensuring the pronunciation of the letter. So it's the way in which the Masoretes identified or reinforced the pronunciation of this particular letter. The furtive pathic will only appear under a final chet or ayin in a word, and it's pronounced before the consonant with which it's associated. So here you can see we've got the furtive pathic under the chet, under the ayin, and under the chet again. And when we pronounce this, we're pronouncing the furtive pathic before the het. So for example 1, we're going to have two syllables. It's going to be bo and then reach. With example 2, we're going to have ra, kia. And with example 3, it's a monosyllabic word, one syllable, ruach, the word for spirit. Now, when you have a furtive pathic, it is never counted in syllabification, because the rule for Hebrew syllables is that you can have only one consonant that begins the syllable and only one vowel in that syllable. If you were to count this vowel, the furtive pathic, in the syllable, it'd actually have two vowels, and that's not allowed. This is kind of a cheater vowel. It's a vowel that helps you to preserve the pronunciation of these weaker consonants at the end of the word, the furtive pathic. Now we come to the topic of the quiescent aleph. You already know that the aleph is silent in Hebrew. But when the aleph occurs without a vowel underneath it or over it in case of the holem, it is termed quiescent. The quiescent aleph is not counted in syllabification. So if we look at our example below, the word for sin, chatath, we see that there is an aleph in red that has no vowel under it. Normally we would expect to see either a vowel or a shawah underneath each of the interior letters of a word. But in this case, you see neither a vowel or a shawah associated with the aleph. Because there is neither vowel symbol or a shawah with the aleph, it is termed quiescent. It's silent. So this particular word is going to be syllabified as chat and then tath. You can see here in our second example, there's the first syllable, chat, and the second syllable, tath. Now, normally the expectation is that a Hebrew syllable must begin with one consonant and have only one vowel. And this syllable still follows that rule. It begins with a consonant, tet, and it has only one vowel, kametz. This secondary aleph is become so silent that it is still important for spelling the word and identifying the word, but it is not rendered at all in spelling or syllabification. When that occurs in a word, it is called quiescent or the quiescent aleph. You can think of it as the silent aleph. Now we come to the topic of the Hebrew diphthongs. There are two diphthongs in Hebrew, the AY diphthong and the AW diphthong. Well, what in the world is a diphthong? Well, look with me at the screen and you'll see that a Hebrew diphthong is a cluster of vowels that always act together as a unit. And there are two of them. There's the AY diphthong up here in the top and the AW diphthong down here below. It's called the AY diphthong and the AW diphthong because of the fact that they're formed with either the yod or the waw. When the diphthong is formed with a yod, it's the AY diphthong. When the diphthong is formed with the waw, it's the AW diphthong. Now, the definition of a diphthong is that it's a cluster of vowels that always act together as a unit. And you need to realize that the waw and the yod in Hebrew are really semi-vowels, just like they are in English. Think of the consonant Y in English. In the word silly, it appears at the end of the word, and it's a vowel. But in the word yellow, the Y appears at the beginning of the word, and it's a consonant. So you can have consonants in Hebrew and in English that kind of tread the border of is it a consonant or a vowel in terms of its sound. And the yod and the waw do that. They're semi-vowels or semi-consonants. And so they can function together with these vowels to make a single unit. The AY diphthong consists of the pathic, the yod, and the hirik under that yod, as you see in our first example, shemayim, or in our second example, bayith. You'll notice that the diphthong is always an accented unit, and it appears together in that cluster. When you syllabify a Hebrew diphthong, it always occurs together as a unit. So our first example over here in syllabification, shemayim, is two syllables. You've got the shin with the kametz underneath it, and then you've got the diphthong mayim. It's a closed accented syllable. And this does appear to violate the basic rule where the syllable must begin with a consonant and have only one vowel. It looks like it has two vowels, and it does, but those two vowels act together as a unit. Vowel clusters are common. They appear in Greek, they appear in English, and so this is just one of those other vowel clusters that appear together as a unit and function as a unit. So the definition of the syllable stands. You could say it begins with a consonant and has only one vowel unit, the diphthong. In our second one, we have the AW diphthong. We have, for example, the last one here, maweth. Here we have the kametz and the waw and the segol. That accented unit is the AW diphthong. And if you look at the way in which they're syllabified over here, you can see that they're always an accented unit and appear together. Those are the two Hebrew diphthongs for now. You just need to realize what they are and how to syllabify them. Later we'll see that they undergo certain changes in particular contexts, and we'll need to know what those are and how that happens. At this stage in our study of Hebrew, we're really working how consonants and vowels work together to form sound units. When we get into the following chapters and we talk about nouns and adjectives and prepositions and verbs, we're going to realize that when words appear in context, the vowels in a particular word may change depending on the function of that word. Those changes can be difficult for students to understand and disconcerting in terms of identifying words and what they're doing. However, those changes really have to do with a syllable's preference for a particular kind of vowel. And if you can memorize syllable and vowel preferences now, then when you encounter changes later in Hebrew within a word, you're going to understand why that happens and expect it to happen. And you won't be confused or caught off guard by them. So these rules, although maybe a little bit tricky or hard to understand at first, just memorize them here. And then what we're going to do is apply them in each of the chapters as we progress through the chapters. And they're going to make more and more sense to you. And I'm going to just hammer away at the rules more and more and just say, you already know why this changes, vowel rule 1. You already know why this changes, vowel rule 2, something like that. So learn these rules and understand the changes that follow. Now, the first thing we need to understand as we look together is that the type of vowel that appears in a syllable is determined by only 2 primary factors. The type of syllable, is it an open syllable or a closed syllable? And then the proximity of that syllable to the accent. Is it tonic, pretonic, or propretonic for open syllables? Or is it simply an accented or unaccented syllable for a closed syllable? So that's really the main part of this is there are 2 types of syllables, open and closed, and particular vowels like to appear in particular syllable types. And what that's based on is how close that syllable is to the accent, all right? So let's look at closed syllables. These are easy to deal with because closed syllables are either accented or unaccented. We don't have to worry about the tonic, pretonic, or propretonic labels when it comes to the closed syllables. There are only 2 types. Does the syllable have the accent mark or does it not? All right? So if the syllable is closed and accented, it's going to prefer the long vowel. If the syllable is closed and accented, it's going to prefer a long vowel. So in our example here, we're going to see davar, and we're going to see a closed accented syllable, and so it's going to take the long vowel, comets. If you memorize the rule, closed accented syllables prefer long vowels, and the example, davar, and that second syllable has the long vowel because it's closed and accented, you know the rule. However, if the syllable is closed and unaccented, it's going to prefer a short vowel. So look at this alternative example below, the example melech or king. This is a word in which it's accented on the first syllable. We know that because of the accent mark over the mem. So now the second or the red syllable is unaccented. It's a closed and unaccented syllable. Because of that, it doesn't take a long vowel, it takes a short vowel, and in this case, the sagol. If you compare these 2 examples, you'll see that they occur in 2 different environments. The top example is closed and accented, so it must take the long vowel. The bottom syllable is closed and unaccented, so it takes the short vowel. If you can take those 2 examples and compare those forms and know that rule, or those 2 rules, then you know how closed syllables work. Closed accented long, closed unaccented short. Easy enough. What about open syllables? Open syllables are going to have 3 possible classifications. Not the simple accented or unaccented of the closed syllable, but rather open syllables are either tonic, pretonic, or propretonic. And we learned those labels earlier. Look at rule number 1 up here. Open tonic syllables prefer short vowels. So in our example, melech, we have an open tonic syllable. It's open because it begins with a consonant and ends with a vowel. And we see the accent mark above it. An open tonic syllable prefers the short vowel. However, the open pretonic syllable prefers the long vowel. In our next example, davar, we have an open syllable, but now it's pretonic. That pretonic syllable prefers the long vowel because it's open pretonic. You can treat these 2 examples, melech and davar, as opposing pairs. Because melech has its accent on the first syllable, it takes a different type of vowel, the short vowel. Because davar has its accent on the last syllable, the first syllable is open pretonic, and so it takes the long vowel. If you can memorize those rules with those 2 examples, then you know how to work and how to apply those rules. Finally, the open propretonic syllable prefers a vocal schwa or reduced vowels with the guttural consonants. Now let's look at our example down here. We've got our tonic syllable, our pretonic syllable, and then our propretonic syllable, the one that occurs before the pretonic syllable. Open propretonic syllables will prefer the shortest possible vowels. If it is a regular consonant, a strong consonant, not a guttural, it will have a vocal schwa underneath it. If it's a guttural consonant, it will have one of the hatef vowels, usually hatef pathic. So the open propretonic syllable will take the shortest possible vowel, hopefully schwa, but maybe one of the Hatef vowels even shorter. Now, these 5 rules, the 2 rules for the closed syllables and the 3 rules for the open syllables, are really important to understand and learn. You may even want to put them on 3x5 cards with their examples and highlight that example so that you can see the rule in application. It makes better sense when you've got the rule itself and the application of it in an example. Finally, we've talked about guttural consonants in the proprytonic position, and at this point I'm just going to tell you the 3 rules for guttural consonants. Now, you're not going to need to know all of these rules right now in terms of application or for syllabification, but you do want to understand these 3 rules, and so I'll just put them out there for you, and we'll review them as we encounter them throughout the rest of the grammar. Earlier in chapter 1, we said, hey, there are 4.5 guttural consonants. There are the 4 regular gutturals, aleph, he, chet, and ayin, and the 1 semi-guttural resh. Well, why are these 4.5 consonants related? They're related because they all react or interact the same way in particular environments. First, the gutturals, including resh, cannot take a dogish forte. You cannot double that consonant because it would double a weak letter, and Hebrew doesn't want you to double weakness. Second, the gutturals, not including resh, cannot take vocal schwa, but they prefer the Hatef or reduced vowels. So under the gutturals, aleph, he, chet, and ayin, you'll never see a vocal schwa. You'll see normally the Hatef pathic or the Hatef segol, rarely the Hatef comets. So you're going to understand that when you would expect to see a vocal schwa in a proprytonic position, you're going to see one of the Hatef vowels if that's a guttural consonant that it's appearing under. And finally, the gutturals prefer A-class vowels. And we mentioned that with the furtive pathic. That is, those gutturals, chet and ayin, prefer A-class vowels so much that if they appear at the end of a word and there's no A-class vowel, they're going to add an extra cheater A-class vowel called the furtive pathic to identify it. So that's a rule we're going to see throughout with the gutturals. They don't take dogish forte, they don't take vocal schwa, and they really like A-class vowels. And those are the gutturals. So what do you need to do before you move on in this chapter? First, memorize the 2 basic rules for Hebrew syllables and the labels for syllable classification. Now that's the tonic, the pretonic, and the propretonic label. But when it comes to closed syllables, we're going to also talk about them as accented or unaccented similarly. You need to know also how to distinguish between the dogish forte and the dogish lene, the silent schwa and the vocal schwa, the comets and the comets hatuf. Now, when you're doing this, I want you to learn the one rule that governs all the other rules or environments. So, for example, with the dogish forte, you know that it's a dogish forte in a begad kefat if it's immediately preceded by a vowel. In all other circumstances, lene. Or for the vocal versus silent schwa, you know if it's immediately preceded by a short vowel, it's going to be silent schwa. In all other circumstances, vocal. And with comets and comets hatuf, that the comets hatuf can occur only in a closed, unaccented syllable. And then in all other environments, it'll be comets. Know those basic rules, and then work on applying those to the other situations in which you'll see it. Become familiar with the furtive pathic, the quiescent aleph, and the 2 Hebrew diphthongs. Please memorize the syllable preferences for Hebrew vowels and the 3 guttural characteristics. Finally, understand that this may be the most important and the most difficult chapter in the grammar. Be patient, don't give up. When you're syllabifying words, take time to understand the rules. That is, look for the fact that, does this syllable begin with a consonant? Does it have only one vowel or diphthong in it? Also, one little trick when you're syllabifying is that every time you see a schwa, whether that's a vocal schwa, a silent schwa, or even one of the Hatef vowels that has that little schwa symbol by the consonant, always syllabify right after that particular letter. The schwa is going to be a syllable divider for you in Hebrew, and knowing that particular rule is going to help you. Finally, if you see a dogish forte in a letter with a schwa underneath it, remember that that dogish forte is going to double both the consonant and the schwa underneath it, producing both a silent schwa and a vocal schwa. Knowing those few little tricks at the end here will help you to syllabify Hebrew words with efficiency and accuracy. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 4, Hebrew Nouns. To date, we've studied the first 3 chapters in the grammar, which covers the consonants and the vowels, and then how those consonants and vowels work together in syllabification. Now we get to put all of that together, and we're going to talk about our first basic word category, nouns. So what will we be studying in this chapter? In this lecture, we will cover how Hebrew nouns inflect for gender and number. We'll also talk about the changes in spelling or vocalization with plural nouns, and then the 2 rules of schwa. Let's begin with some of the basics for Hebrew nouns. First, Hebrew nouns have gender. They are either masculine or feminine, though a few nouns are both masculine or feminine. That is, their gender is common. Grammatical and natural gender do not necessarily correspond except in those nouns where gender is relevant, meaning this. Just because a noun has feminine gender does not mean that it's a feminine characteristic. For example, the word for law in Hebrew is Torah. It's a feminine noun, but it doesn't mean the law is intrinsically feminine by nature. It's just the inflection pattern that it follows. Now, with nouns that do have gender associated with them, like man or woman, king or queen, then gender, natural gender, and grammatical gender will correspond. But you just need to know that gender is a category for inflection, not necessarily for biological gender. Thirdly, Hebrew nouns are inflected for number. There is singular and plural, what you'd expect with English nouns. There's one item or more than one item, plural. But Hebrew also has the dual number when it's talking about a number that is 2. So there's singular 1, dual 2, and then plural, anything more than dual, and sometimes even anything more than 1. So Hebrew nouns have gender and number in the categories of masculine and feminine, singular, plural, and dual. Those are the basic categories for Hebrew nouns. Let's then look at the paradigm or inflectional endings for Hebrew nouns. Look at your screen with me. You'll see that there are 2 basic categories. There's the masculine inflection, and then there's the feminine inflection. There's the singular and the plural and the dual for both masculine and feminine nouns. Let's read together the masculine paradigm. We'll begin with sus, susim, and then susayim. Sus is the singular, meaning horse. Susim is the plural, meaning horses. And then susayim is the dual, meaning 2 horses. And you'll observe, highlighted in red in each of those second 2 forms, the plural endings that are added to the noun to make it plural. Now, in English, if I have a singular noun, like horse, I add the S to it to make it plural, horses. This is exactly how Hebrew works. You have the singular noun sus, and then instead of adding S to it like we do in English, we're going to add im to make it plural, susim. If you're familiar with the Hebrew word cherubim, that's the plural form for cherub. Cherubim, that's the im ending, that's the plural ending for nouns. So you really already know the plural ending. The dual ending consists of the ay diphthong, aya, and then the mem, susayim. So let's say this paradigm together again, sus, and then susim, and then susayim. And those red inflectional endings mark the nouns for gender and number. The masculine singular noun is endingless. The masculine plural noun ends in im, and the masculine dual noun ends in ayim. Let's go to the feminine nouns now. Let's pronounce those together. There is Torah, Toroth, and then Torathayim. Torah, Toroth, and Torathayim. Torah is feminine singular, and it's identified by the Kametz He ending, highlighted in red. Toroth is the feminine plural, and it's identified by the Holam Wow Tau or oath ending that appears on the end of that word. And then there's the dual ending for the feminine, Torathayim. It's also the ay diphthong with the mem ending, but an additional tau after the final root consonant. This noun paradigm must be memorized in the categories of masculine and feminine, singular, plural, and dual. You must be able to say it out loud and then write each of those forms precisely. It may even help you to memorize it using the color with a black and a red pen. So let's say those masculine nouns again in the categories of singular, plural, and dual. It's sus, susim, and susayim. Then in the feminine, it's Torah, Toroth, and Torathayim. And you'll see that each category, in terms of masculine and feminine, singular, plural, and dual, has its own particular set of inflectional endings. And that's how you identify a noun as either masculine or feminine, singular or plural or dual. So those endings are key to identifying the gender and number for each noun. And that's why it's important to memorize this paradigm like a robot with absolute precision. In the noun paradigm, you're going to learn that feminine singular nouns end in Kametz He. And that's true. Many, many feminine singular nouns do end in Kametz He. But feminine singular nouns can also end in tau. We want to look at a few of those nouns together now. Look at your screen with me. You'll see that in addition to Torah, that's a feminine singular noun that ends in a comet, it's your paradigm noun. But now let's look at the next noun, bath. That's the Hebrew word for daughter, and it's a feminine singular noun, and it ends in pathic tau. The word for glory, tefereth, is also a feminine singular noun, and it ends in sagol tau. There's the Hebrew word for covenant, barith, and it terminates or ends in hirik yod tau. And finally, the feminine singular form, malkuth, for kingdom, it ends in the shurik tau. Now, what you can see is that these feminine singular words that terminate in tau have a variety of connecting vowels that appear before them. The pathic, the sagol, the hirik yod, or the shurik. It really doesn't matter what the connecting vowel is. You just need to realize that a feminine singular noun can end in comet or tau. And in fact, those are two characteristically feminine consonants in Hebrew. And you're going to see that that hey and that tau are going to mark feminine words throughout Hebrew. So keep an eye on that. It's a good thing to learn about the language. Now that we've looked at the basic paradigm and we understand that feminine singular nouns can end in either comet or tau, let's look at a number of different nouns and observe kind of the consistency with which we see these nouns inflected for gender and number, so you can see why that paradigm and the pattern is so important. Look at your screens with me, and first we'll consider the masculine singular category, and we'll look at sus and melech, davar, yeled, and yom. Each of those nouns are masculine and singular, and they have no special ending to mark them as such. So masculine singular nouns are endingless nouns. In the masculine plural category, we have susim, malachim, davarim, yeladim, and yamim. Observe in this category how all of the plural nouns end in im. That's like adding s to a word in English to mark it as plural. Those im endings are consistent throughout and will tell you that that word is both masculine and plural. Let's move over to the feminine singular column, and we'll see malkah, Torah, and chomah. Each of those nouns end in comet and follow that paradigm noun, Torah. But we also have bath and kesheth. Both of those nouns end in tau, and so they're also feminine. Feminine plural nouns, melachoth, toroth, chomoth, banoth, and keshathoth. Notice or observe how all of those feminine plural nouns end or terminate in holem wow, tau, oath. It doesn't matter what it ends with in the feminine singular, whether comet or tau, it's always going to end in oath in the feminine plural. And then finally, let's look at a variety of dual nouns, yomayim, torathayim, raglayim, yadayim, and einayim. You can see all of those nouns end with that ay diphthong followed by the mem and are easily identified as dual. Now, there aren't that many dual nouns in Hebrew, so you're not going to see those as much as you see the singular and plural nouns. So those are really the ones to focus on. But you will see that dual ending, so it must be memorized with the others. You now understand that Hebrew nouns are inflected for both gender and number. Now, in a Hebrew lexicon or dictionary, a noun is only going to appear in one particular form. It won't appear in all the inflected forms. So the question is then, what form appears in the Hebrew lexicon or dictionary? The answer to that question is the singular noun. The lexical form for any noun is the singular form. So if the noun is masculine, the lexical form will be masculine singular. If the noun is feminine, its lexical form will be feminine singular. If you have a plural noun, you're going to have to reconstruct it for its singular form and look up that form in the lexicon. So for example, the lexical form for susim, for example, a masculine plural noun, is sus, masculine singular, because the lexical form for any noun is the singular form of that noun. You would look up susim in the lexicon under the singular sus. Similarly, the lexical form for toroth, the feminine plural, is Torah, the feminine singular. You would look toroth up in the lexicon under Torah. Once again, the lexical form for any noun is the singular form, whether it's masculine singular or feminine singular, and that's the form that you look it up in the dictionary or the lexicon. One of my favorite things about teaching grammar and about teaching students rules is that rules were meant to be broken. And all of my students like to understand that rules were meant to be broken. When we're really teaching about grammar or syntax, what we're talking about is really the dominant pattern that establishes a rule. Well, in any language, there are patterns, and then there are patterns that are broken. So we're going to briefly consider 5 different categories of exceptions to the rules for Hebrew noun, inflection, and pluralization. Let's look at the first category of exception to nouns. The first one is this: some feminine nouns are also endingless nouns. That is, they won't end in komate and they won't end in tau. They will look like masculine singular nouns, but they will be feminine singular. The 10 most common nouns of this type are listed on the left side of your page. They are eretz, for land or earth, yad, ear, nefesh, cherev, evan, regel, aim, calf, and ozen. All of these nouns are endingless. They don't end in komate or tau, but they're feminine. And so you'll need to become familiar with some of these high-frequency nouns that are endingless, feminine singular nouns. But there are patterns to this that can help you out. First, you'll recognize that many of these endingless feminine singular nouns are related to body parts like hand or foot or hand or palm again or ear. You'll also observe that many of these nouns are accented on the first syllable. These are called segulate nouns, and we'll study those a little bit later. But look at eretz is accented on the first syllable. Nefesh, cherev, evan, regel, ozen. This particular category of noun, that is 2-syllable nouns accented on the first syllable, do have a high frequency of endingless feminine singular nouns in them. And so it's one of the things that can help you identify them. So segulate nouns, or 2-syllable nouns accented on the first syllable, which we'll talk about later, or body parts, have a propensity to be endingless feminine singular nouns. Look at our second exception to the set of rules that we have here. Some singular nouns of one gender take the plural endings of another gender. But these unexpected endings do not cause a shift in gender. Now, what this means is that a masculine singular noun will take a feminine plural ending. But it's still a masculine plural noun. It just has feminine plural endings. Let's look at our first example together. Here we have the very common or frequent noun av, which means father, and observe that the plural form is avoth, fathers, with the holomau tau ending, characteristic of the feminine plural. Now, even though this is highly irregular in what we might expect, nothing changes in terms of gender or number. It's still masculine and plural, and that oath ending tells you as much. The second example, shame, which means name, is a masculine noun, but it occurs with the feminine plural endings. So don't be caught off guard with some of these nouns when they take endings you don't expect. The lower 2 examples, shana or isha, are feminine singular nouns that end in komate, so you'd expect them to have holomau tau endings, but they don't. They take the masculine plural endings like shanim and nashim. So these nouns that are masculine or feminine take the endings from the other gender, the feminine or the masculine. So you want to make sure that you identify these in your vocabulary memorization. Now, in the grammar and in the vocabulary sections in the grammar, we've identified all nouns that have irregular endings or form their plurals irregularly. So you can always know which nouns need special attention. Our third exception to the normal rule is this: there are 3 Hebrew words that are always dual in form, but singular in translation. So you can see in the words on the left side of the page here, Shemayim, Mitzrayim, and Mayim, the word for heaven, Egypt, or water. These nouns are always dual in form, but normally singular in translation value. And so when you memorize these as vocabulary items, you'll just be memorizing Shemayim. There won't be any form without that I-am ending, and that's actually the lexical form as well. So you want to take special care with these words that you're understanding that these are the lexical forms. And they're high frequency, so we see the word heaven or Egypt or water a lot in Hebrew. So you'll come to see them, and they'll be just as regular as can be once you are exposed to them in context over and over again. Our fourth exception is this: some nouns alter their consonantal stem when plural endings are added. Now, this is perhaps one of the tougher exceptions, and you'll have to really be careful in memorizing these for vocabulary, but let's look and see what happens here. Here we have the masculine singular noun yom, and we can see that its masculine plural form is yamim. That holom wow has disappeared from the singular and is now represented by a comets in the plural. So when you're memorizing your vocabulary, make sure that you list both the masculine singular and the masculine plural form because you want to be able to connect these two items in vocabulary. Our next example, ish, is pluralized this way, anashim. Here the hierik yod is dropped out, there's been a noon that's added, and it looks like an entirely different word. But the masculine plural form for ish, meaning man, is anashim, meaning men. It has the characteristic hierik yod mem ending, or the im ending, but it has added a noon and dropped the hierik yod. Similarly, the feminine singular noun isha, woman, also adds a noon, drops the dogish forte out of the shin, and it's pronounced nashim. Nashim. This one is particularly odd because not only does the feminine plural form of woman take masculine plural endings, but it also drops an aleph and adds a noon. It's tricky, so you're going to have to memorize anashim and nashim with the lexical form in order that you can properly connect those things. Now, you can imagine that words like yom and ish and isha, the words for day and man and woman, occur all over in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, they're very common words. And here's a linguistic rule that can help you, especially as you approach not only Hebrew, but any other language you study. Usually in a language, that which is most common is most unusual. That is, words or forms that are high frequency in a particular language usually come with a lot of variation in their form. For example, consider the verb to be. That's perhaps the most common verb in English. And you know that as an English speaker that there are many, many forms of that word. There's am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. 8 different forms. That which is most common is most irregular. And these are some of those really common nouns that are very irregular. Now the nice thing is at first it'll be tough to kind of connect maybe isha and nashim, but you're going to see it so much in the Hebrew Bible as you're reading that it'll become second nature very quickly, and it won't be a problem at all after you get over the kind of the vocabulary memorization issue. And finally, our 5th exception to the rule is that we have here the feminine plural ending oath, or holem wow tau, may be spelled defectively as oath, just with holem and not with holem wow. Now, in chapter 2, we talked about defective and full spelling. And one of the patterns for defective spelling is that the holem wow can be spelled just as a simple holem. And that happens frequently with the feminine plural ending. In our examples, eithoth, the feminine plural for congregation, you can see that the feminine plural ending, which you would expect to be holem wow tau, is simply written as holem tau. Or mishpachoth, the feminine plural form of family, likewise, holem tau. Or chukoth, the feminine plural noun for statute, holem tau. This is the defective spelling of the feminine plural ending, and it's relatively common in the Hebrew Bible, so you will want to become familiar with the defective spelling of the feminine plural ending. So now that we've learned our basic paradigm for the noun, let me rehearse it with you again. Sus, susim, susayim, masculine. And then the feminine Torah, toroth, torathayim. And we've talked about 5 different patterns or categories of exceptions that we should expect as we see nouns in the Hebrew Bible. We now want to talk about how a noun will change its spelling when it's pluralized. How a noun will change its spelling when it's pluralized. And what do I mean by that? You learned back in chapter 3 that there are 2 things that control a vowel's preference for a particular type of syllable. The first is the type of syllable. Is it open or closed? And then the second is the proximity of that particular syllable to the accent. Is it accented or unaccented for closed syllables? Or is it tonic, pretonic, or propretonic for open syllables? When you add an ending to a noun, either to make it plural or dual, you are changing the accent and syllable structure of that particular noun. Because of that, vowels will shift when you pluralize them. At first, this may be confusing to a student, but if you learn those 5 vowel preferences back in chapter 3, then all the changes you're going to see in this particular area are going to make sense in light of those rules. Let's look at some of these spelling changes together. The first category of spelling change is no change in spelling. And these are nice because you're just going to take your lexical form and you're going to apply the ending to the end of it, and there's going to be no change. There are 2 types of nouns that do this. The first is a monosyllabic noun like shear or oath with an unchangeable long vowel. That is, that hierik yod vowel letter in shear or that holem wow vowel letter in oath are unchangeable long, meaning they're not going to reduce ever, whatever you do to them. Now, they may be defectively spelled, but they're always going to be those long vowels. And so they're never going to change. And so you're just going to add to them the endings im, as in shirim, or oath, as othoth, and you've got the form. We also have nouns that already are reduced in the first syllable, like rachov or chalom. So these nouns are already reduced in that first syllable, and so whenever you add an ending to them, they're not going to change. So rachovoth or chalomoth, the spelling of the word or the vocalization of the word will not change with the application of the inflectional endings. So these are nouns with no change in their spelling. However, most nouns undergo spelling changes, and this category is not the common one. The second pattern of pluralization we want to look at is the propretonic reduction pattern. This means that when you add a syllable to a word, it's going to shift the pretonic syllable into the propretonic position, and there's going to be vowel reduction. Let me show you what I mean by going to the whiteboard. Let's begin by writing out the Hebrew word davar, the word for word. And we're going to syllabify that word by drawing the line after the dalet and the comets. We now have two syllables, each of which begin with one consonant and have only one vowel. Now what happens then when we add the plural ending? We'll apply the hirik, the yod, and the mim. And what we've done is we haven't just added an ending to the word, we've changed the syllable structure of the word as well. We now have to resyllabify after the bait and the comets, and now we have a three-syllable noun. We have a tonic syllable, a pre-tonic syllable, and a pro-pre-tonic syllable. Because we've changed the accent and the syllable structure, we observe that the accent has shifted from over the bait to over the final syllable, reem. That puts this first syllable right here in the propretonic position, and we know that fifth vowel rule from chapter 3, that open propretonic syllables prefer the vocal schwa or reduced vowels with gutturals. This is not a guttural, so we're going to erase our comets, and we're going to add vocal schwa. That's an example of propretonic reduction. So we get propretonic reduction when a two-syllable noun becomes a three-syllable noun with the addition of plural endings. Let's go back then to our slide. You can see that in each of the examples, we have propretonic reduction highlighted in red. Here we have davarim, levavoth, ananim, and chatzeroth. In each case, you can observe that the examples on the left, davar, levav, anan, and chatzer, they've been pluralized by adding the inflectional endings either feminine or masculine plural. And because of that, the first syllable has undergone propretonic reduction. In the first two examples, it's simple vocal schwa. In the second two examples, we have the hatef pathic because those words begin with a guttural. And gutturals do not take vocal schwa, but prefer the hatef vowels, usually hatef pathic. And so you can see in chapter 3 we covered the three rules that kind of govern guttural consonants, and this is one of those rules. Gutturals will not take vocal schwa, but the hatef vowels. And you can think of the schwa and the hatef vowels as related to each other. So that's what propretonic reduction looks like. It shouldn't give you too much trouble. You're going to see propretonic reduction everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And if you understand the rule that governs it, all of the changes will follow rules. And when changes follow rules, you'll be able to understand those changes and know what's happening, and you won't be caught off guard by them. Our third pattern is the segolate noun pattern. Now, what in the world is a segolate noun? We mentioned that earlier, but let me define it. A segolate noun is a two-syllable noun with an accent on the first syllable. Now, you'll recall back in chapter 3, we said that normally nouns are accented on the last syllable, the final syllable of a word. But all of these nouns are not accented on the last syllable. They're accented on the second to the last syllable, and they're called segolate nouns. Now, why are they called segolate nouns? Well, if you look briefly at some of the forms like melech, cherev, or sefer, or boker, or zerah, you're going to see that all of those forms have either two or one segols in them. That preference for the segol vowel has ended up becoming the nickname for those vowels, segolate or segol nouns. Now, not all segolate nouns have segol in their spelling. Look at our last example, na'ar. Here you can see that we have two gutturals in the final position, the ayin and the resh, and so there's just a preference for that A-class vowel there. So the definition of a segolate noun is a two-syllable noun accented on the first syllable, but most of those, or many of those, will have segol or double segol in them. Now, when these words are pluralized, they break all the rules and follow what's called the formative vowel pattern. They're always going to be under the first root letter vocal schwa are a hatef pathic with a guttural. And then under the second consonant, comets. And you can see that here in our first example for kings, melachim, and I'll circle the pattern right there. You have the vocal schwa under the mem and the comets under the lamed. And you'll observe that that's the case for each set of examples below, vocal schwa and comets. The only slight exception to that rule is in our second example where you have the hatef pathic under the guttural. And you already know why. Gutturals won't take vocal schwa, but hatef pathic. This is the segolate noun pattern. You can call it the formative vowel pattern because later we'll learn that kind of segolates are kind of reconstructed nouns and they are follow their own set of rules at times. And so when they were pluralized, they just followed kind of a standard pattern and they just bleached it over all the other patterns. So you just got to memorize that pattern. Our fourth pattern of noun pluralization deals with what's called the geminate nouns. Geminate nouns are nouns that originally had 3 root letters, but now have only 2 root letters. But when they're inflected in the plural, that original root letter comes back as a dogish forte. Let me show you what I mean. Let's look at our first example together. The Hebrew noun am, which means people. You'll see that it's spelled as ayin mem, 2 root letters. However, its original root was ayin mem mem, which we've identified on the right side of the page for you. When this noun is pluralized, that second mem reappears as a dogish forte in the geminate consonant. So you can see now that that particular root used to be ayin mem mem, and its spelling as such is preserved in the plural. Many words in Hebrew have a history to them, and you can see that history come out in their inflection. So sometimes the singular form of a word will look different than the plural form, and that has to do with the history of that particular word or those forms of words in Hebrew. And it's fascinating to learn about them, and I'll try to point those patterns out as we go out through the grammar so that you'll become comfortable with seeing all the different forms. So again, look at our second example, chetz for arrow. It's a geminate noun because it used to be, or was originally, chet, sade, tzade. The second and third root consonants are identical or twins, and that's why it's called a geminate noun, because geminate is from the Latin gemini, which means twin. In its spelling, in the plural, that geminate consonant comes back as a dogish forte in the tzade. Likewise, our third example follows the exact same pattern. Chok, the word for statute, is spelled in its lexical form with 1 kof, but it was originally a geminate noun where the second and third root letters were identical or twins, chet, kof, kof, and that comes back in the inflected form where you've got the kof with dogish forte. Now, not all monosyllabic nouns were originally geminate, but the class that was originally geminate will take this dogish forte in the plural. That's how you can distinguish the two. The key thing is here, don't be caught off guard when you see a noun taking that dogish forte in the plural. Our final category for noun pluralization comes with masculine nouns ending in sagol hey. Now, the reason I want to mention this particular class of noun is that normally nouns that end in hey, particularly comets hey, are feminine. But this is a particular noun that ends in sagol hey, not comets hey. Nouns that end in sagol hey are masculine singular. And when they take feminine plural endings, that sagol hey, that final vowel letter, drops off before the ending is added. And so you're going to lose the sagol hey in the form. So for example, we can see here that the masculine singular form for field is saveh, but there is no sagol hey in the plural form. That form has dropped the sagol hey and then added a plural ending. Now, many of these nouns also take irregular endings. That is, the masculine singular form will have the feminine plural ending. It doesn't matter. It still is plural and still is masculine. However, you need to understand that that sagol hey is dropped. Now, the reason that's tricky is because in order to look up sadoth in the lexicon, you're going to have to cut off the holem wow tau ending, that's the plural ending, and you're going to have to add sagol hey. So you're going to have to do a little bit of reconstruction work. You can think of this words like this as kind of a crime scene where you've got to go in and reconstruct what's been lost. All right? So you've got to take off the ending and reattach the sagol hey. And for now, this is the only category of masculine noun that will drop that ending where you'll have to reconstruct it. Let's look at the two other examples here where we have ma'aseh and machaneh, the Hebrew words for work and camp, you can see that there are plural forms ma'asim and machanim or machanot. This word is pluralized both ways. Drops the segol hey and adds the ending. And so you'll need to reconstruct those. We've identified these forms and the plurals in the vocabulary section, so you'll have a point of reference. Finally, there's the last category for noun pluralization. That's really the category of irregular pluralization. These nouns are just entirely irregular and must be really memorized as vocabulary items. And so what I do is I put my vocabulary, when I'm memorizing vocabulary, I put my lexical form in the middle of the card, and then I'll put my inflected form that I've got to memorize in the bottom left or bottom right corner. And I always say both forms together. So every time I see, for example, the Hebrew word ish on my vocabulary card, I'm always going to say the other word that is associated with it, anashim, masculine plural. And by doing that, you'll kind of memorize the different forms and associate them automatically because of the vocabulary acquisition that you'll have. Or isha, nashim, ir, arim. We've covered the first two, but look at this third one, ir. It drops the hirik yod and adds comets in its masculine plural. It's actually a feminine plural noun. Av will take the feminine plural endings for avoth. Bayeth, it's an older word and common word, and it is pluralized batim. It drops the yod between the bait and the tau. We have bath for daughter, and look, it goes to banoth. The tau drops and it adds nun. Banoth looks like the feminine plural form of sons, so that can be very confusing. And then we've got bain and banim. So banim, where the E-class vowel changes to comets, and then you get the hirik yod mem ending. Again, these nouns need to be memorized, but if you consider the fact that these words man and woman and city and father and house and daughter and son are some of the most common words in the language, and what's the rule? That which is most common is most irregular, and these nouns prove to be such. The good news for that is that you're going to see these nouns so often in the Hebrew Bible that their irregularity will pretty much be bleached out in your mind within no time, and you'll be seeing these words as entirely regular, know exactly how they're working. The last thing we want to talk about before we end this chapter are the two rules of Shawah. Now, we're not going to begin applying these rules until the subsequent chapters, but we need to learn them here. Now, the two rules of Shawah relate to how Shawahs interact with each other at the beginning of a word. It only has to do with Shawahs at the beginning of a word. The first rule of Shawah is this. When two vocal Shawahs appear together at the beginning of a word, the first Shawah becomes hirik, and the second Shawah becomes silent. So look over at the example on the left. Here we have a word that begins with two vocal Shawahs. In Hebrew, this is not allowed. You cannot begin a word with two vocal Shawahs. So what happens? The first Shawah changes into a hirik, and the second Shawah becomes a silent Shawah because it's now immediately preceded by a short vowel. So in example 1 on the left, we have two vocal Shawahs. In the example here on the right, there are no vocal Shawahs. There's a hirik in a closed syllable. So that's the first rule of Shawah. Whenever two vocal Shawahs appear together at the beginning of a word, they become hirik followed by a silent Shawah or hirik in a closed syllable. That's an important rule that's going to be applied over and over again in Hebrew as we progress through the chapters, both nouns and other parts of speech and even verbs. Rule of Shawah 2 is similar in terms of environment. It also deals with a Shawah or a group of Shawahs at the beginning of a word, but this time with a Shawah and a Hatef vowel that's associated with a guttural. Here's the rule. A vocal Shawah cannot precede a guttural with a Hatef vowel. It cannot. Instead, the first syllable will take the corresponding short vowel of the Hatef vowel. What does that mean? Let's look at our first example on the left where we have a vocal Shawah coming before a Hatef vowel. And you can see, if you look closely, that it's really the two of those sets of dots together. In Hebrew, we don't like two sets of Shawahs like that together, whether it be a regular Shawah, a vocal Shawah, or a Hatef vowel. What happens then? What happens is observed in the example on the right. Here you're going to have a pathic vowel. Why? Because the Hatef vowel that precedes it is the Hatef pathic. And the first syllable is going to copy the vowel of the second syllable. So because you have a Hatef pathic in the second syllable, you're going to have a pathic in the first syllable. Sometimes we call this the copycat rule. That is, the first syllable is going to copy the vowel from the second syllable. That's the That is rule of Shawah 2. So rule of Shawah 1 is that two vocal Shawahs at the beginning of the word will produce Hirik followed by silent Shawah. And rule of Shawah 2 will take, we have a Shawah and a Hatef vowel, and that Shawah is going to convert into the short vowel of the Hatef vowel. It's very important to memorize these two rules because we're going to see them applied over and over again in the subsequent chapters. So before you move on then, what should you do? The first thing you need to do is memorize the paradigm for the Hebrew noun like a robot. Be able to spell every consonant and every vowel with absolute certainty and confidence and quickly. If it takes you more than 5 minutes to write out that paradigm, you don't know that paradigm. You should be able to write it out in less than 2 minutes. It's only 6 forms. Secondly, become familiar with the 5 types of exceptions to the regular patterns of pluralization that you will encounter with Hebrew nouns. Hebrew nouns appear in almost every verse of the Hebrew Bible. And so if you don't get the rules down now and the patterns down now, you'll be constantly frustrated by what you see. So know those rules or exceptions. Thirdly, memorize the 6 patterns of noun pluralization and the reasons for that. It's not just important that you memorize what happens. You need to understand why it happens. And if you can understand both of those things, you're going to be able to apply those rules as we progress through the chapters. And then finally, memorize the 2 rules of Shawah. This is our first major chapter on a particular part of speech in Hebrew, the Hebrew nouns. And we've covered the basics of the Hebrew nouns in its entirety. So if you memorize well this chapter, you know how nouns work in terms of their inflection for gender and number in the categories of masculine and feminine, singular, plural, and dual. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 5, the definite article and the conjunction wa. In this lecture, we will cover the form and spelling of the Hebrew definite article, the word for the, and the form and spelling of the Hebrew conjunction, the word for and. And consider the fact that these 2 words together occur 75,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. The definite article, the Hebrew word for the, appears 25,000 times approximately, and the conjunction meaning and appears 50,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. So these 2 forms occur more than any other form in Hebrew, and so they're very important. We're going to learn how to say the and in Hebrew. And these 2 words are a lot of fun because they're easy to recognize, and we're going to learn a lot of good things about how Hebrew works as we prefix these 2 words to other words. Now let's consider what I just said, that we're going to prefix these words to other words. Let's consider the basic form of the definite article. One way in which a noun can be made definite in Hebrew is with the prefixing of the definite article to that noun. The definite article in Hebrew consists of ha, which is hey with pathic, plus the dagesh forte in the first consonant of the noun to which it is prefixed. So let's begin by looking at the example on the left of the page here, hamelech. This is the word for the king. And you'll see there's the vowel pathic underneath that consonant, and then there's the dagesh forte that appears in the first consonant of the noun to which the article is prefixed. That means this: in Hebrew, the word for the never appears by itself. It's always prefixed to the noun that it makes definite. And so you can see here, if we begin at the right side of the page, we have our form, hey, pathic, and dagesh forte, attached or prefixed to the noun, melech, masculine singular, and it renders this third form, hamelech. That dagesh forte is an important part of the spelling and must not be missed. That's the basic spelling of the definite article in Hebrew, hey and pathic and dagesh forte, those 3 items. Now, when the Hebrew definite article is prefixed to a noun that begins with a begad kafad consonant, that begad kafad consonant is going to have a dagesh lene in it. When you prefix the noun to that begad kafad consonant, the dagesh lene is going to become a dagesh forte. Let's look at our first example, bayeth, the Hebrew word for house. In the Hebrew word bayeth, we see in that bait a dagesh lene because it's a begad kafad consonant at the beginning of a word. However, in the example on the right, habayeth, the house, we see that that dagesh lene has converted into a dagesh forte. How do we know it's a dagesh forte? Because it's immediately preceded by the short vowel, pathic. Again, our second example, Derek, begins with the begad kafad consonant dalet, and when it takes the definite article, had Derek, that Dagesh Lene becomes the Dagesh Forte, and again, Torah becomes HaTorah. The Dagesh Lene becomes a Dagesh Forte. So this change doesn't cause too much trouble. Just realize that when the definite article is prefixed to the Bagad Kafad consonant, the Dagesh Lene in it becomes a Dagesh Forte. Now let's talk about nouns that begin with a guttural consonant. You know that a guttural consonant will never ever take a Dagesh Forte or a Dagesh Lene. You can never put a dot inside of a guttural consonant. It's like those gutturals have force fields around them that resist all Dagesh dots. So what happens then when you prefix the definite article to a guttural consonant? Where does that Dagesh Forte go? Well, sometimes it's rejected and the previous vowel lengthens. Sometimes it will get rejected and the previous vowel won't lengthen. And sometimes it will just become irregular in its category and change its vowel class entirely from a pathic to a segol. So let's look at the three ways in which the guttural affects the spelling of the definite article because of that Dagesh Forte and its inability to go inside the guttural. We'll begin by learning the phenomenon known as compensatory lengthening. That is, when the guttural consonant rejects the Dagesh Forte of the definite article, there's going to be some compensatory lengthening of that vowel under the article. Here's how it goes. When prefixed to aleph, the resh, and sometimes ayin, the guttural rejects the Dagesh Forte of the article and the pathic lengthens to comets. So let's look together then at our first example. Here we have the indefinite masculine singular noun ish. You'll observe that it begins with the guttural aleph. A guttural consonant cannot take a Dagesh Forte. So when we add the definite article, we add the he, the pathic, and the Dagesh Forte. The Dagesh Forte won't appear in the guttural, and so the pathic lengthens to comets. I think I want to show you this one on the whiteboard, so turn to your whiteboard with me. In our previous example, we had the noun ish. Aleph, Hirik Yod, Shin. We now want to add the definite article to this noun, and the definite article consists of three parts. First, we'll add the he of the definite article, and we'll add the pathic of the definite article, and then we want to add the Dagesh Forte. But the guttural, that is the aleph, will not take the definite article. It's got a force field around it. When the aleph rejects the Dagesh Forte, the short a vowel pathic will then lengthen to comets, and that is compensatory lengthening. The rejection of the Dagesh Forte causes the short a vowel to lengthen to the long a vowel comets. So from pathic to comets. That is the phenomenon known as compensatory lengthening. Let's go back to the screen. You can see the same phenomenon in the next two examples where we have rosh and ear prefixed with the definite article spelled hey comets and hey comets. The reason for that is because the Dagesh Forte, that is an important part of the spelling of the definite article, has been rejected by the guttural, and it causes that pathic or short a vowel to lengthen to the long a. And that is why we call this category compensatory lengthening, because the vowel lengthens or compensates for the loss of the Dagesh Forte by lengthening. In addition to the phenomenon known as compensatory lengthening, when you add the definite article to a guttural, there is also the possibility of encountering what's called virtual doubling. What is virtual doubling? Well, when prefixed to he or chet, the guttural rejects the Dagesh Forte of the article, and the pathic does not lengthen to comets. So here you'll get the rejection of the Dagesh Forte, but no lengthening. This is called virtual doubling or virtually no doubling. Let's look at our first example. Here we have the Hebrew word for palace, heichal. When we add the definite article to it, we want to add the he, the pathic, and the Dagesh Forte. Well, he is a guttural consonant. It rejects the Dagesh Forte, but he and chet do cause virtual doubling. There's no doubling at all. There's no lengthening of the vowel, so they just call this virtual doubling or virtually no doubling. Let me show you what I mean by that at the whiteboard again. Here we have our noun heichal. To this noun, we're now going to add the definite article, the temple. We're going to add the he of the definite article, the pathic of the definite article, and then once again, the guttural has a force field around it. But this time, instead of rejecting the Dagesh Forte, which causes the vowel to lengthen, it just rejects the Dagesh Forte, and there's no lengthening. Therefore, this pathic just stays as the short A-class vowel, and this is known as virtual doubling. Let's go back and look at our second example. In our second example, the word begins with a chet, choma. The he and the het both cause what's called virtual doubling. And so when we add the definite article, again, we get the he and the pathic. Then the Q represents the kof, the N represents the noon, the M represents the mim, the L represents the lamed, the W represents the wow, and then the Y represents the yod. So what that means is that when one of these consonants, the Skinnem-Levy consonants, appears with a Dagesh forte and a vocal schwa, that Dagesh forte can drop out. I think it's helpful to see how it works on the whiteboard. First, let me write the masculine plural noun yaladim for children and point it vocal schwa, comets, and then the hirik yod mim ending. Now the rule of Skinnem-Levy is this. When I prefix the definite article to this form, it's he, it's pathic, and it's Dagesh forte. And that works. You can add a Dagesh forte to a yod without any trouble. However, the yod is one of the Skinnem-Levy consonants. It's the Y in the Skinnem-Levy form. And whenever you have this environment, a consonant, Skinnem-Levy consonant, with a Dagesh forte and a vocal schwa, and here's what we have right here. What happens is that Dagesh forte can drop out. It doesn't always drop out, but frequently it will drop out. You need to be used to seeing that phenomenon. It's called the rule of Skinnem-Levy, and that's the environment in which it occurs. So again, you can see in our examples, in our first example, Yeladim, we have Ha-Yeladim, Hey, pathic, but no Dagesh forte. The Dagesh forte has simply dropped out of the first consonant because of the rule of Skinnem-Levy. Same thing with our second example, Hemeraglim. Here the Hey and the pathic of the definite article appear, but the Dagesh forte does not, even though a Dagesh forte can by law appear in the mim. Because of this particular environment, the Skinnem-Levy consonant with the vocal schwa, it drops out. And again, it's important to learn this rule because it will appear with nouns and adjectives and verbs later on, and so it's just a great rule to learn that's going to apply in a number of different places. And if you learn it now, then you'll see it being applied over and over again. That's the nice thing about Hebrew. Even though you're going to experience words changing their spelling and their vocalization patterns, there are only a very few rules that they're following. And if you kind of get used to those rules early on, you're going to be better off and identify those changes as patterns and rules and not as exceptions later on. Here's a summary chart of the definite article and the way in which it's spelled. First, there's the regular spelling, Hamelech, the Hey, the pathic, and the Dagesh forte. In our second example with the Begad Kafat, you have the Dagesh Lene becoming a Dagesh forte. In our third example, Ha'ish, you have compensatory lengthening. In our fourth example with Ha-Hekal, you have virtual doubling. In our fifth example, you have He'anon with the irregular Segol vowel. And then finally, you have the dropping of the Dagesh forte because of the rule of Skinnem-Levy in Ha-Yeladim. So it's important that you understand the different spelling options, but it's more important to me that you understand the reasons for those spelling options. That is, you want to understand that the guttural rejects Dagesh forte, and you want to understand that there are three possible responses, that there's the compensatory lengthening, the virtual doubling, and the irregular Segol. You want to understand the rule of Skinnem-Levy. You want to understand the rules that precipitate the spelling changes so that you can apply those rules in other environments later. And this is a great environment in which to learn these rules because it's kind of a limited and easy environment to see the definite article being added to the nouns. Now that we've mastered the basic spelling of the definite article, we're going to turn our attention to the conjunction va or the conjunction wow in Biblical Hebrew. This is the main conjunction. There are other conjunctions in Biblical Hebrew, but this is the main conjunction occurring at a rate of over 50,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. So how is the conjunction spelled? Before most consonants, the conjunction is spelled as a simple wow with vocal schwa underneath it. The reason for this spelling of vocal schwa is that it occurs primarily in the propretonic position, and so that vocal schwa was super common and it became a frozen form. Perhaps it doesn't matter why it happened, you just need to know that that's the basic spelling, and we're going to see some changes that go with it. So here's how it works. First, you begin with the conjunction wow spelled with vocal schwa. Then you take the noun to which you want to add it to, and you glue it right to the front of it as a prefix. Like the definite article, the conjunction wow never appears by itself. It's always prefixed to the word that follows it. So the basic spelling is wow plus vocal schwa, but Like with a definite article, there are other spelling options. The first is this, that before certain consonants, bait, mim, or pay, we're going to have a slightly different spelling feature. This is known as the bump rule. Before bait, mim, or pay, the so-called bump consonants, the conjunction is spelled as shurik. Now, the word bump is another mnemonic device to identify bait, mim, and pay. And here the conjunction is spelled as shurik. So as you look as our initial form, here you have the wow with the vocal schwa, and here you have our nouns that are nice and easy to see. The one begins with bait, one begins with mim, and one begins with pay. But when you add them to the words in this right column, you'll observe that the wow with vocal schwa has now become a shurik, or the unchangeable long vowel shurik. This is the only time in biblical Hebrew where you will see a syllable as a vowel by itself. It's the one exception to that rule that every syllable must begin with a consonant and have only one vowel. This is one syllable in Hebrew that has no consonant and only one vowel. It's the exception to the rule. But like I said, all rules are meant to have exceptions, and that's what makes them fun. You can see here in our first example that something like what would have been what-bane has become uvain. And notice that the dogish lane in the begad kafad consonant has dropped out after the conjunction. That's because the conjunction is now preceded by a vowel, and so the dogish lane will drop out. Something what would have been originally wa-melech has now become u-melech because it occurs before the mim consonant, and something that would have been something like wa-paro has now become u-faro with the prefixing of the conjunction because it begins with one of those bump consonants. When you add the conjunction wow to bait, mim, or pay, it won't be spelled with wow plus vocal schwa. It'll be spelled as shurik, and you've got to memorize that. There's one more environment in which the conjunction wow can be spelled as the shurik in biblical Hebrew, and that's before vocal schwa. Before consonants with a vocal schwa, the conjunction is spelled as shurik. So look at our examples here. In the first example, we have wa followed by na'arim, and you can see that this word begins with the vocal schwa. So our final form then is u na'arim. In our second example, wa safarim, because the samach has vocal schwa underneath it, that conjunction is going to be spelled like shurik, u safarim. And the same thing at the bottom with Shemuel, the word for Samuel. We would have something like wa Shemuel, but because that conjunction is prefixed to a word that begins with vocal schwa, it is spelled with shurik. So there are two environments in which the conjunction wow is spelled as shurik. First, before any of the bump consonants, bait, mim, or pay. And secondly, before any consonant with a vocal schwa underneath it. And this is the only time you'll ever have a syllable that begins with a vowel and to which there's no associated consonant. Now, what happens when the conjunction wow is prefixed to a word that begins with a hatef vowel? Well, before consonants with hatef vowels, the conjunction is spelled with the corresponding short vowel, and this is simply rule of schwa 2. So that's why we learned the two rules of schwa in the last chapter. It's because we're going to see those rules applied in these new chapters as we progress through the grammar. So here's what we have in our first example. We have the conjunction wow prefixed to anashim. Now anashim begins with that hatef vowel, hatef pathic. And that is the application of rule of schwa 2. We're going to get the conjunction spelled with the pathic because it's going to copy the vowel of the hatef vowel. The same thing in our next example here with wa emeth. We're going to get the segol vowel in this case because it's copying the hatef segol under the aleph right here. And then in our last example, we have the hatef comets wa choli. We're going to get the spelling here of the comets because it's copying this vowel here of the hatef comets. So here you can really see rule of schwa 2 in great application and how it's copying each of the vowels. You can see in this first example, the hatef pathic provokes the pathic, the hatef segol provokes the segol, and the hatef comets provokes the comets. So you see how that's the copycat rule, or rule of schwa 2. There are also occasions in which the conjunction wow is prefixed to an accented syllable, and sometimes that provokes the spelling of the conjunction to change to wow plus comets because it's in the pretonic open position and it prefers a long A-class vowel in that particular instance. And so here's the rule. Before monosyllables, or words with a single syllable, or words accented on the first syllable, the conjunction may be spelled with comets. Now I say may be spelled because this rule is not always followed, and there are some pretty strict environments in which it occurs, but you need to know at least about the possibility of it. So that's why I say this spelling convention is not always followed. So in our two examples, we have the monosyllabic noun sown. And when prefixed with the conjunction wow, it's spelled with the comets in the open pretonic position. And here we have the segolate noun that has the initial accent. It's a two-syllable noun accented on the first syllable. And that environment also provokes the spelling of the conjunction as comets. Now again, I want you to think of this as a spelling possibility, but it doesn't always occur. So let's look at the summary then. The basic form of the conjunction wow is spelled with vocal schwa, as in wa-ish. However, it may also be spelled as shurik in two environments. First before the bump consonants, bait, mem, or pei, or before consonants with vocal schwa. So here are examples u melech and u safarim. Finally, we have before hatef vowels, it will take the corresponding vowel of that hatef vowel, as in weh anashim. Or before accented syllables, it may appear as comets, wah tzon. Now, when it comes to the spelling of the conjunction wow, you need to realize that it's not so much the spelling that's important, but the rules that govern the spelling, because those rules are going to teach you things you need to know for the subsequent chapters. In fact, the consonant wow does not appear as the first letter of many words in Biblical Hebrew. There are just a few words and they occur only a very few times. So at a rate of over 99%, when you see the consonant wow at the beginning of a word, it's going to be the conjunction wow. There are a variety of spellings, but those spellings are not going to make any difference in terms of what that word does. No matter how it's spelled, it means and. Okay? And the environments in which it occur are not overly important in the abstract, because if it's wow, it's and. It's those rules that are important, though, because those rules are going to show you and teach you things that you need to know later. So know both your options, but the rules behind those options are even more important as we progress through the grammar. So what do you need to know before you move on? First, memorize the basic spelling of the definite article. Hey, pathic, dogish forte. Second, memorize the alternate spellings of the definite article and the context in which they occur, especially as they appear with guttural consonants and the categories or changes like compensatory lengthening, virtual doubling, and irregular segol. Next, memorize the basic spelling of the conjunction wow, and then memorize the alternative spellings of the conjunction and the context in which they occur and the rules that govern those realities, like, for example, rule of schwa 2. Now, there aren't that many things really to learn in this chapter. We're really learning how to say the and. But the big deal is the rules that govern the spelling changes, because those rules will become important for you as we progress through the grammar.